The world, as it existed 74,000 years ago, was a place of quiet rhythms, an earth still untouched by cities, nations, or the noise of civilization. Dawn rose gently over grasslands and forests, and the wind carried only the sound of leaves brushing against one another. In this vast and ancient silence, small bands of early humans moved like shadows across the landscape, unaware that their existence hung by the thinnest of threads. Theirs was a world measured not in centuries or progress, but in seasons, migrations, and the fragile inheritance of survival passed down through countless generations. Yet beneath their feet, beneath the calm soil that cradled them, something unimaginable was stirring. Long before our ancestors had words to describe it, the earth had already begun writing a story in fire. Deep inside the crust, thousands of cubic kilometers of magma pressed upward with a slow, relentless force. It gathered, swelled, and pushed against rock that had held fast for millennia. To our ancient ancestors, the land felt eternal, unchanging, predictable. But the truth was far more complex. Earth was alive in ways they could not see, holding within it the power to erase entire species in a single breath. And somewhere along the ancient trade winds, particles of sulfur and ash from minor eruptions drifted into the atmosphere. They were warnings, small, unrecognized, overlooked by creatures whose attention was consumed by food, shelter, and survival. Humanity did not yet have the language to name fear beyond the immediate, the predator in the grass, the hunger of a long drought, the sickness that spread through a small band. The threat beneath Lake Toba, however, was unlike anything they had faced. It was too large for instinct to grasp, too distant for fear to latch onto. Nature often hides its greatest dangers behind stillness. As night fell across prehistoric landscapes, the sky shimmered with starlight that stretched uninterrupted from horizon to horizon. Around small fires, early humans whispered in simple speech, sharing stories of spirits, animals, and the mysteries of their world. They were not yet aware that these stars, which seemed so stable and eternal, had witnessed countless extinctions before them. They, too, would watch the moment when the earth erupted with a ferocity unmatched in the history of our species. This prologue is a breath before the plunge, a moment suspended in time. We linger in a world where humanity is still young, still vulnerable, still tied intimately to the patterns of nature. It is a reminder of how delicate our presence on Earth truly is. For although we imagine ourselves unshakable, the truth is that our entire species once came closer to extinction than any modern catastrophe has ever dared bring us. In this quiet prelude, the planet holds its breath. The land around Toba is deceptively serene, forests ripple under the touch of gentle winds, rivers carve their ancient paths through fertile soil, and distant mountains stand sentinel over thriving ecosystems. But beneath this calm, the magma chamber, larger than any now known, stirs like a sleeping giant shifting in its rest. Pressure builds with slow patience, the kind only the earth possesses. Cracks widen fraction by fraction. Rock melts, shifts, strains. Had there been eyes capable of seeing deep into the planet, they would have witnessed a churning inferno, a molten sea preparing to force its way to the surface. But the humans living thousands of kilometers away sensed nothing. How could they? They had no understanding of subterranean forces, no concept of supervolcanoes, no way to imagine an eruption that could darken the skies of the entire world. Their lives moved according to simpler rhythms, hunting, gathering, finding warmth at night, raising children, mourning the lost, and celebrating the rare moments of abundance. In this innocence, they existed just as all species do, unaware of the catastrophes that history will later reveal. Yet, even without understanding, our ancestors felt the fragility of their existence. They carried within them an ancient awareness that life could shift without warning. A sudden storm, an unexpected predator, an injury, any one of these could change the fate of a small band forever. It was this fragile awareness, combined with adaptability, that had already allowed early Homo sapiens to spread slowly across Africa and into parts of Asia. But no instinctive sense of danger or survival strategy could have prepared them for what was coming. As the final days before the eruption approached, nothing seemed out of place. The earth hides its greatest upheavals behind perfect stillness. A single morning could have begun with the soft calls of birds, the rustle of trees, and a sky painted in calm blues. There were no omens written for humans to read, no signs clear enough for them to interpret. The ground beneath Toba was preparing to shatter the illusion of stability forever, but to those living their ordinary lives, the world appeared eternal. This prologue invites the viewer to step into that ancient calm, to feel what it meant to exist at a time when humanity was still learning its place in the world. It asks us to imagine the vulnerability of a species not yet shaped by civilization and technology. And it reminds us that the story of humanity is not a straight line of progress, it is a fragile thread woven through moments of unimaginable danger and unlikely survival. Soon, everything will change. But for now, the wind carries only ashes of the past and whispers of the catastrophe yet to unfold. Before the eruption that nearly erased us, Earth was a place of quiet majesty and complex beauty. 74,000 years ago, the world felt impossibly vast compared to the tiny human population scattered across it. Early Homo sapiens existed in small, mobile groups, rarely numbering more than a few dozen individuals. Their lives followed the movements of animals, the ripening of plants, and the slow shifts of seasons. These people did not yet imagine themselves as masters of the world, instead, they were participants in a delicate balance of survival where every decision, every step, and every shared meal mattered. Africa, the cradle of humanity, was still a mosaic of thriving ecosystems, lush river valleys, dense forests, open savannas, and rugged highlands. In these fertile regions, small communities gathered water from streams, shaped simple tools from stone, and built temporary shelters from branches, leaves, and animal skins. Theirs was a life lived close to the land, without the abstraction of future planning beyond the next hunt, the next resting place, or the next safe path away from predators. And yet, in this simplicity, there was an underlying intelligence. They understood animal tracks, seasonal patterns, edible plants, and the unspoken language of nature better than we ever will again. Daily routines were both harsh and beautiful. At dawn, the first to wake would stir embers into flame, letting warmth push away the cold of the night. Children, few in number, for survival was not guaranteed, played in the dust, imitating the adults who shaped blades, tied fibers into ropes, and sharpened wooden spears. Women and men moved with practiced rhythm, sharing responsibilities rather than dividing them strictly. Cooperation wasn't philosophy, it was necessity. A fractured group did not survive long. Farther east, beyond the African heartland, pockets of Homo sapiens and other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and potentially yet unknown populations, roamed across Eurasia. Dense tropical forests stretched through Southeast Asia, and it was here, in the shadow of the ancient supervolcano Toba, that early humans lived unaware of the giant beneath their feet. These communities hunted small animals, gathered fruits and tubers, and found water along muddy riverbanks. They had never seen snow. Their world was green, humid, and alive with noise, insects buzzing, birds calling, rain beating on leaves. Social structures were intimate and woven tightly with emotion. A group was more than a collection of individuals, it was survival embodied. Every loss, whether through sickness, predator attack, or accident, sent ripples of grief through the community. Likewise, every birth was celebrated as a rare blessing, a fragile reinforcement of the future. As humans sat in circles around evening fires, sparks rising into starlit skies, they shared stories, not complex myths, but simple narratives of hunts, dreams, ancestors, and the movements of animals. These early stories were the seeds of the profound storytelling instinct that would one day define our species. Although their numbers were small, their world was vibrant. The landscapes held endless wonders, herds of antelope crossing golden plains, elephants carving pathways through the brush, towering trees offering shelter and food, and rivers acting as life-giving highways through immense territories. In these thriving ecosystems, humans were observers more than influencers. Predators such as lions, hyenas, leopards, and saber-toothed cats challenged them daily. Humans did not dominate the food chain, they simply carved out a narrow space within it. But even in this primal setting, subtle changes were already shaping humanity's future. Stone tools grew more refined. Fire use became more sophisticated, sometimes controlled throughout the night. Groups developed early forms of symbolic thinking, ornaments made of shells, pigments scraped from rocks, and patterns carved into bone or wood. These were the first hints of a cognitive leap, a quiet revolution happening long before the world would be tested by disaster. Climate patterns during this period were shifting, though not dramatically enough to unsettle human life yet. Gentle variations in rainfall and temperature guided migrations, altering animal habits and plant cycles. Human groups adapted fluidly to these changes, moving with the rhythms of nature rather than attempting to resist them. There were no borders, no ownership, only the vast openness of the world and the instinctive understanding that land, water, and shelter must be shared. And yet, despite the beauty and abundance in many regions, life remained fragile. A single failed hunt could mean hunger. An unexpected injury could doom an adult, or worse, leave the entire group struggling to compensate. Diseases passed quickly through close-knit communities, and with no knowledge of medicine beyond herbs and rest, survival was never guaranteed. Every day carried quiet tension, the understanding that the world was generous but indifferent. Still, humanity endured. In the warmth of the firelight, in the laughter of children, in the shared effort of the hunt and the gathering, there was something profoundly resilient emerging. Humans had begun to form deep emotional bonds, not only for practical survival but because these bonds gave meaning to existence. This emotional richness would one day become a defining strength during the trials ahead. Meanwhile, beneath Lake Toba in present-day Sumatra, the earth was gathering its own momentum. Pressure increased slowly, building over thousands of years. But there were no signs on the surface that hinted at the scale of the catastrophe to come. The early humans living near Toba had no sense that their peaceful world was perched atop a geological bomb. They sang, hunted, gathered, raised families, and gazed at the same moon we see today, all while the ground beneath them hid a force capable of reshaping global history. This was the world before the fall, serene but vulnerable, abundant but fragile, full of life yet balanced on the edge of a silent abyss. Humanity had flourished in small pockets across continents, unaware that everything they knew, their rhythms, their landscapes, their sense of permanence, was about to be challenged in ways they could not imagine. The stage was set, the players in place, and the world rested in a moment of deceptive calm, waiting for the first tremor that would signal the beginning of an event powerful enough to nearly wipe our species from the earth. Long before humankind ever whispered stories around flickering firelight, the earth had already begun composing a tale of unimaginable force deep beneath the surface of what we now call Sumatra. Lake Toba, serene and mirror-like in the present day, hides the scars of the colossal eruption yet to unfold in this chapter of history. But 74,000 years ago, before the lake even existed, the land above Toba appeared deceptively ordinary: verdant forests, cascading rivers, and thriving wildlife. For early humans moving through the region, it was simply another part of the vast, mysterious world they tried to navigate. They had no concept of the titanic forces accumulating beneath their feet. Beneath this landscape, a magma chamber stretched across an area larger than some modern nations. It was a monstrous reservoir of molten rock, held in place by an increasingly fragile shell of crust. Over hundreds of thousands of years, tectonic plates had converged and shifted, melting rock and feeding magma into this growing underground sea. Pressure built slowly, almost imperceptibly, as gases dissolved into the molten mixture. At first, the Earth bore the pressure well, absorbing stress as it had done countless times before, but eventually, the balance began to falter. To understand Toba, one must imagine a living planet, dynamic, restless, and powerful. The magma chamber beneath the supervolcano was like an immense, swollen heart beating against confining stone. The more magma that accumulated, the greater the tension within the crust. Most days, nothing dramatic happened. The ground remained silent, trees continued to grow, the air hummed with insects, and early humans walked across terrain that seemed unshakable. But deep below, the chamber expanded relentlessly, fracturing rock layer by layer. Occasionally, small tremors might have rippled through the area, barely perceptible quivers in the earth. Early humans, if they noticed at all, may have paused briefly, sensing a faint vibration underfoot. But they did not interpret these moments as warnings. They had no geological understanding, no stories passed down from previous generations about catastrophic eruptions of this scale. Even if minor eruptions occurred in the distant past, their memory had long faded, swallowed by time. The Earth, for all its vastness, often conceals its greatest threats behind long stretches of quiet. The crust above Toba thickened and thinned in response to shifting pressures, like an overstretched skin. Magma surged upward at times, retreating at others, seeking pathways to the surface. Each intrusion of molten rock weakened the structure just a little more, carving invisible faults and cracks. Some of these cracks reached within kilometers of the surface, but still the land remained outwardly serene. From a geological perspective, Toba had erupted multiple times before, caldera systems often do. But none of these previous eruptions matched the scale that the chamber was now capable of unleashing. The forces accumulating were unlike anything the planet had witnessed in hundreds of thousands of years. Eventually, the chamber reached a critical point. The internal pressure exceeded the strength of the crust above it. At this stage, the Earth's surface was not simply a passive shell, it was a trapdoor waiting to collapse. Yet on the surface, life continued undisturbed. Dense tropical forests swayed in warm breezes. Rainstorms nourished the soil. Herds of animals moved through the lush environment, following instinctive migration routes. Predators stalked silently, prey grazed without fear of anything beyond claws and teeth, and humans gathered fruits and roots while their children played in the mud near riverbanks. Everything about the environment suggested stability, abundance, and continuity. But the signs of impending catastrophe were present, even if invisible to early humans. In the deeper layers of the Earth, gases built pressure rapidly. Carbon dioxide, water vapor, and sulfur dioxide all dissolved into the magma, waiting for release. If the chamber were compared to a massive boiler, then the gases were steam building behind a sealed hatch. The moment the hatch gave way, the expansion would be explosive on a scale that defies imagination. The tectonic plates that shaped Indonesia, where the Indo-Australian plate is forced beneath the Eurasian plate, were the driving mechanism behind this deadly ticking engine. Every millimeter of movement added energy to the system. With each shift, the magma chamber swelled like a lung inhaling deeply. And at some point, that lung would exhale with devastating force. One can almost imagine a final quiet evening before the catastrophe, with stars shimmering overhead and early humans settling near small fires, unaware that the ground below them was nearing its breaking point. Perhaps the night animals called as usual, insects buzzed, the forest canopy rustled in the wind, and the river flowed smoothly without hint of what was coming. To those living in the region, the world felt timeless. Yet on a geological scale, time was running out. The crust above the magma chamber had begun to deform subtly, likely creating uplift across kilometers of land. Animals may have sensed something unusual. Some species have been known to react to changes in magnetic fields or low-frequency vibrations, but these signs would not have been clear to humans. If the ground warmed in certain places or small fissures emitted faint gases, these events would have blended seamlessly into the normal variability of a volcanic region. As the moment of eruption drew closer, tension within the chamber reached a threshold beyond which no natural force could restrain it. The Earth had been accumulating energy for tens of thousands of years. And all it would take was a final fracture, a single break in the surface, to unleash it. The eruption was not triggered by any sudden change in human activity or climate, it was simply the inevitable release of geological pressure that had been building for ages. This was the reality beneath the sleeping giant, a world unaware of its looming destruction, resting atop a colossal force that would soon redefine the story of humanity itself. The land was calm, the skies were clear, and life flourished. But beneath that fragile veneer of normalcy, magma surged and roared, straining against the Earth's crust like a trapped beast ready to break free. The humans living above had no reason to believe that their world was about to rupture. No prophecy, no warning, no sign clear enough to interpret. Only the silent, unstoppable buildup of pressure beneath Toba, an ancient giant waiting for the moment it would awaken and reshape the fate of an entire species. For countless generations, the land above Toba had slept in peace. But on the day the eruption began, the world seemed to inhale sharply, as if the earth itself knew something irreversible was about to unfold. It may have started with a tremor, a deep, rolling vibration that shook the ground in a way no human had ever felt before. Animals froze mid-step. Birds launched into frantic flight. Even the wind seemed to pause. Early humans, scattered across forests and riversides, looked around in confusion as the soil beneath their feet shivered like a living creature. Then came the sound. A roar so deep and resonant that it felt less like noise and more like the earth screaming from its core. To humans unprepared for such a phenomenon, it must have seemed as though the world was tearing itself apart. Trees quivered. Rocks tumbled. The first explosive vent tore through the crust, punching upward with violent force. Within seconds, the eruption accelerated into a catastrophic chain reaction, cracks spreading outward like shattered glass, each one releasing more pressure, more fury. The magma chamber, long constrained by rock and time, finally found its escape. A column of superheated ash and molten rock blasted into the sky with unimaginable velocity, faster than any storm, louder than any thunder, brighter than any fire. It rose upward not by meters or hundreds of meters, but by tens of kilometers, carving through the atmosphere like a spear of light and darkness combined. The sky, once the familiar canvas of early human life, transformed into something monstrous. Those living closest to the eruption would not have had time to react. Entire landscapes vanished in seconds beneath pyroclastic flows, clouds of searing ash and gas racing faster than any human or animal could run. Forests combusted instantly as temperatures soared higher than molten metal. Rivers evaporated. Stone melted. Every living thing within hundreds of kilometers was erased without a chance to understand what was happening. But even those far beyond the immediate destruction felt the shock. The explosion was not a single blast, it was a continuous eruption, sustained by the collapse of the land into the magma chamber below. As the ground caved inward, the volcano expelled more ash, more pumice, more gas, more molten rock. Each moment fed the next, building a plume so massive that it penetrated the stratosphere. Lightning crackled within the column, illuminating the boiling clouds of ash in flickers of violent blue-white light. To early humans watching from the distance, the sky no longer resembled sky at all. Instead, a towering column of darkness rose like a god of fire and shadow, blotting out the sun. Daylight dimmed to twilight. Then twilight faded into complete darkness, even though the sun still hung somewhere behind the growing veil of ash. The atmosphere itself trembled with the force of the blast, shock waves rippled outward, flattening trees, knocking over humans, and stirring fear in hearts already struggling to understand the enormity of what they were witnessing. As explosions continued, the earth seemed to convulse. The plume expanded outward, forming an umbrella-shaped canopy that spread in all directions. Ash began falling like a gray, suffocating snow. But this snow was deadly, abrasive, hot, and toxic. It coated the ground, the leaves, the water. It clung to human skin, irritated eyes, and turned breathing into a painful effort. People fled blindly, covering their faces with animal hides or leaves, but no instinct or tool could shield them from the scale of the event. Thunder-like booms echoed continuously, yet these were not storms, they were the volcano exhaling its molten heart. The roar became a constant backdrop to terror, so loud that even shouts between humans were swallowed. The ground shook again and again as new vents opened, releasing waves of ash that rolled outward in dense, roiling curtains. Farther away, where the ash was still thin and the danger not yet lethal, humans gathered in confusion, pointing toward the horizon where the sky burned. They did not have language rich enough to describe it, but they must have felt instinctive dread. Fire was familiar to them, but this was fire on a cosmic scale, fire that rose into the heavens instead of toward the treetops, fire that rumbled like a living beast, fire that cast shadows that flickered across the land in chaotic rhythm. As the eruption reached its peak, the plume became tall enough to disrupt atmospheric patterns across entire continents. Winds shifted violently, carrying ash far beyond where any human could see. Sulfur particles entered the upper atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and beginning the chain of events that would eventually plunge the world into volcanic winter. But in this moment, the immediate terror was overwhelming, the sense that the world they knew was collapsing. Even the animals sensed it. Herds stampeded away from the eruption, moving instinctively in the opposite direction of the ash cloud. Predators abandoned hunts. Birds fled until their wings grew too coated in ash to continue. Lakes and rivers filled with falling debris, becoming dark, contaminated waters. Plants sagged beneath the weight of ash. Every breath carried grit. Every step became heavier. The psychological shock to early humans cannot be overstated. This was not just a natural disaster, this was an assault on their understanding of reality. Until this day, the world had followed predictable rhythms. Clouds brought rain. The sun rose and set. The seasons changed. But now, the sky itself appeared shattered. The land groaned. The trees burned. Life's familiar patterns dissolved in a sudden storm of fire and ash. And yet, even as some fled in panic, others stood frozen, mesmerized by the impossible sight before them. Human curiosity, our double-edged gift, pulled certain individuals toward the edges of danger, trying to make sense of the towering plume that turned day into night. Though they could not understand it, the image would be etched into memory, passed down not through words, but through instinct, stories, and unspoken fear. As the final stages of the eruption unfolded, the caldera collapsed entirely, pulling kilometers of land into a massive sunken basin. The plume remained for hours, perhaps days, continuously feeding ash into the sky until the entire region was transformed into a wasteland of darkness and silence. The eruption was so powerful that it altered global atmospheric circulation, yet in the immediate aftermath, everything near Toba was simply gone. The day the sky broke open was more than a geological event, it was a turning point in the human story. It marked the moment when our species faced a force beyond comprehension, a force vast enough to threaten our very existence. Those who survived the initial chaos did so not because of strength or knowledge, but because of distance, chance, and the fragile resilience that would soon be tested even further. This day ended not with sunset but with a darkness far more enduring, a darkness born not of night, but of ash. A darkness that would follow humanity across continents, settling into soil, water, lungs, and memory. The eruption was only the beginning. The true struggle for survival was still to come, and the world would soon realize what it meant for the sky to break open and never fully close again. In the hours and days following the eruption, the world began to transform in ways humanity had never experienced. Even far beyond the immediate radius of destruction, the air carried a strange heaviness, as though the sky itself had descended closer to the ground. What began as a faint dusting soon became a relentless fall of ash, fine, abrasive, and suffocating. The winds, strengthened by the violent injection of ash into the atmosphere, scattered particles across South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and deep into Africa. What had once been clear skies now shifted into a muted haze that dimmed the sun and blurred distant horizons. For early humans, this ashfall felt like the world's breath turning sour. They had no memory of such a phenomenon. Snow was unknown to many of them, so when pale, powder-like debris drifted down from the sky, confusion mixed with fear. Some may have touched it hesitantly, expecting coolness, only to recoil at its faint warmth and gritty texture. Ash collected on their skin, clung to their hair, and irritated their eyes and throats. Breathing grew more difficult, especially for the young and the old. Each inhale carried particles that scraped the inside of the lungs. The landscape changed quickly. Forests once painted in shades of green and gold became gray and ghost-like. Leaves drooped under the weight of ash, some snapping from branches. Streams, vital for drinking and hunting, filled with cloudy, contaminated water. Ash floated on the surface, sank to the bottom, or mixed into thick sludge. Fish suffocated as oxygen levels dropped. Animals that relied on scent struggled to track prey or avoid predators. The very sounds of the world shifted, softened, muted, muffled by the blanket settling across the land. To humans living in South Asia, the nearest regions to Toba's inferno, the ashfall was like a slow, suffocating storm that seemed endless. Days passed without sunlight piercing the thickened sky. The air took on an acrid smell, rich with sulfur. People covered their mouths with hides or woven fibers, but nothing could fully protect them. The more the ash fell, the heavier the atmosphere became, turning breathing into a conscious and exhausting act. It wasn't long before coughs echoed through camps, accompanied by watery eyes and raw throats. As the ash spread farther, Africa too began to feel its effects. Though the layer was thinner there, it was still enough to disrupt daily life profoundly. Hunters lost visibility as the haze distorted distances. Animals migrated unpredictably, confused by the dimming light and failing vegetation. Plants that once thrived under warm sunlight now struggled to photosynthesize beneath an oppressive gray canopy. Growth slowed. Leaves lost their luster. Fruits shriveled prematurely. The ashfall affected not only the light but the temperature. With sunlight blocked, the world cooled. Mornings became unexpectedly brisk. Even regions accustomed to warmth felt a growing chill. For humans, this shift brought new challenges. Fires needed to be maintained more carefully, requiring more fuel at a time when dry wood was increasingly difficult to find under layers of ash. Ash-covered vegetation resisted burning, and much of the fallen material was dampened by moisture trapped within the atmospheric haze. Ash also affected communication and movement. Tracks on the ground became obscured, making it harder for hunters to follow prey or avoid predators. Navigation landmarks disappeared beneath uniform gray layers. Rivers altered their courses as they clogged with sediment. Entire familiar paths vanished. The world felt disorienting, as though humanity had suddenly been thrust into an unfamiliar version of their once-known environment. The emotional toll was just as severe as the physical one. Humans, already living in small isolated bands, now faced a world filled with quiet dread. The ash cloud turned the sky into a ceiling of oppression, stripping away the comfort of stars at night and the guidance of the sun by day. Fires glowed strangely under the muted atmosphere, casting distorted shadows that flickered with an unsettling glow. Nights grew colder and darker, and the psychological impact of a sky that no longer behaved predictably weighed heavily on those who had always relied on natural cycles. Some groups may have interpreted the falling ash as a sign from spirits or ancestors, an omen of danger or change. Without scientific understanding, they relied on intuition, tradition, and fear. Stories may have emerged in whispers around campfires, painting the ash as a punishment, a sign of cosmic imbalance, or a message from unseen forces. Whether these early interpretations survived through time is unknowable, but it is likely that the trauma imprinted itself onto human memory in ways that would influence storytelling for generations. Animals suffered equally, if not more so. Grazers found their food coated in abrasive grit that damaged their teeth and irritated their stomachs. Carnivores faced scarcity as prey populations weakened or fled. Birds, unable to soar effectively in the thickened air, plummeted out of the sky or remained grounded. Even insects struggled, their delicate wings and air-sensitive bodies overwhelmed by the fine particles saturating the environment. Yet the ashfall was not uniform everywhere. Some regions experienced only light dusting, while others were buried under layers thick enough to reshape the landscape entirely. In certain places, ash accumulated so deeply that it buried plants, small animals, and human footprints alike. Temporary shelters collapsed under its weight, forcing groups to relocate despite the dangers. Riverbeds overflowed as ash clogged channels, redirecting water to create sudden floods that consumed camps without warning. Still, amid this devastation, small signs of human resilience emerged. Groups adapted quickly, as they had always done in times of hardship. Some began storing cleaner water in hollowed gourds or animal skins, protecting it from contamination. Others created makeshift coverings to shield sleeping areas from falling ash. Those with sharper observational skills learned to read subtle differences in the ash's texture or density, allowing them to predict shifts in the wind. These adaptations were not enough to fully counter the disaster, but they were small sparks of ingenuity, early evidence of the flexibility that would eventually help humanity survive the coming volcanic winter. In the farthest regions touched by Toba's ash, the effects were milder yet still profound. Even a thin layer could disrupt plant growth and animal behavior. As months passed, the ash embedded itself in soil and water, becoming part of the earth itself. It coated leaves that would eventually fall, mixing into the top layers of sediment and marking a distinct geological signature that scientists would discover tens of thousands of years later. By the time the ash settled, the world had changed irrevocably. The sky remained dim. The temperature had already begun to drop. Ecosystems reeled from the sudden shock. For humans, every breath carried the memory of falling ash, and every step through the muted landscape reinforced the unsettling truth: they were confronting a force far greater than anything they had imagined. The ashfall was only the first wave of the catastrophe that Toba had unleashed. The true challenge, the volcanic winter, was about to begin, and humanity had no choice but to endure the unfolding darkness. In the weeks and months following the eruption, the ash that once fell like a suffocating rain settled into the soil and water, but the world did not return to normal. Instead, a deeper, more insidious transformation began to unfold, a transformation not limited to the regions touched by ash, but one that stretched across continents and oceans. The sky, still heavy with suspended particles, allowed only a fraction of sunlight to reach the Earth's surface. Days turned dim and cold, with the sun appearing as a pale, distant orb struggling to pierce through the lingering haze. The Toba eruption had not only reshaped landscapes, it had changed the atmosphere itself, plunging the planet into what scientists now call a volcanic winter. Temperature drops were not gentle. They arrived like a sudden rejection of the warmth humanity had always depended on. Regions that had once been lush and temperate grew cold. Nights became harsher, longer, and more hostile. Even in parts of Africa, far from the eruption and historically one of the most stable climates on Earth, the sudden chill was unmistakable. Early humans, accustomed to warm breezes and predictable patterns of rain, now found themselves shivering under skies that never quite brightened. The cold altered everything. Plants, robbed of sunlight, struggled to grow. Their leaves drooped, their roots starved, and entire species failed within months. Grasses withered and died, leaving open plains barren and silent. The food chain began to crumble from the bottom up. Animals that once grazed across vast savannas wandered in search of sustenance, often collapsing from hunger before finding anything edible. Predators, unable to rely on their traditional hunting grounds, followed these weakened herds, but they too faced starvation as the balance of life unraveled. Humans felt the consequences immediately. With plants failing, the animals they depended on began to disappear. Hunting became more difficult and more dangerous. Prey animals grew scarce and unpredictable, often thin and weak when found at all. Gathering plant foods, berries, nuts, roots, offered little relief, as most vegetation suffered from the sudden drop in temperature and reduced sunlight. The forests grew eerily quiet. Even insects, which had once hummed through hot afternoons, dwindled to near silence. The psychological weight of the changing environment pressed heavily on human communities. They could no longer predict seasons. Rains came late or not at all. Dry seasons stretched on, only to be interrupted by sudden storms fueled by an atmosphere destabilized by volcanic gases. It felt as though the world had slipped out of rhythm, and humans were caught in the uncertainty of these unpredictable cycles. Cold brought new challenges to basic survival. Humans had known hardship, droughts, predator attacks, seasonal scarcity, but this was different. This was a persistent, global hardship that offered no relief. People huddled closer around fires, using more wood than ever, even as fallen trees grew scarce. Tools and shelters needed reinforcement against the cold winds. Clothing made from animal hides had to be improved and layered, and even then, it was not enough during the coldest nights. Some groups attempted to migrate in search of warmer regions. These journeys, already difficult in normal times, became perilous in the extreme cold. Long treks across barren landscapes offered no guarantee of food or safety. Many who set out never reached their destinations, succumbing to starvation, exhaustion, or exposure. Those who survived brought stories of lands just as cold and unforgiving as the ones they left behind. The volcanic winter had followed them. Water sources became another source of struggle. In some regions, rivers shrank or disappeared entirely, evaporated by changes in weather patterns or blocked by ash deposits. In colder climates, water froze over, forcing humans to break through ice for access. Because sunlight was limited, evaporation slowed, altering entire hydrological cycles. Lakes stagnated, streams ran sluggishly, and marshes dried up unexpectedly. The world's heartbeat, the circulation of water, had faltered. The atmosphere, still filled with sulfur aerosols from the eruption, reflected sunlight back into space. This created an Earth trapped in its own shadow. Even during midday, the light felt foreign, weak, cold, and distant. The sky sometimes appeared tinted with strange colors, muted yellow, pale orange, or a dull red as sunlight filtered through the lingering debris. This phenomenon must have been unnerving to early humans, whose cognitive frameworks were built around natural cycles. Day no longer felt like day. Night no longer felt like night. Despite these challenges, humans tried to adapt. They reinforced shelters with mud, branches, and animal skins to retain heat. They discovered new ways to store food, burying it underground to preserve it longer in the cold. They expanded their diets, experimenting with plants they had previously ignored, though many were barely edible. Cooperation became more crucial than ever. Groups that worked together had better chances of survival than those divided by conflict or isolation. Fire, always a symbol of life, became sacred. Maintaining it was a daily struggle. Ash-covered wood resisted burning. Dampness lingered everywhere. Sparks died repeatedly. Humans learned to protect their fire like a living member of the group, shielding it from wind and moisture, feeding it carefully. Those who lost their fire faced a desperate scramble to find another source, whether by creating sparks through friction or by seeking help from neighboring groups, if any still survived nearby. As months turned into years, the volcanic winter continued its oppressive influence. Dramatic population declines occurred across the globe. Some human groups vanished entirely, unable to adapt to the harsh new reality. Others dwindled in number until only a handful remained. Scientific estimates suggest that during this period, humanity may have been reduced to a few thousand reproductive individuals, a bottleneck so severe that our species teetered on the brink of extinction. And yet, the Earth itself carried on with indifferent momentum. Storms raged. Winds shifted. Temperatures dipped and climbed unevenly as the atmosphere attempted to rebalance. Slowly, the ash in the sky began to settle, but the effects lingered. Volcanic winters are not short-lived events, they are prolonged imbalances that take years, sometimes decades, to reverse. This meant that even as sunlight slowly re-emerged, the climate remained disrupted. the world humans had known before Toba was gone. In its place stood a colder, harsher, more unpredictable Earth. Vegetation patterns changed permanently. Migration routes shifted. Regions that were once hospitable became wastelands, while other areas offered new but temporary refuges. The age-old rhythms of life, growth, migration, reproduction, no longer followed familiar patterns. Through all of this, early humans faced the same existential question each day: how do we adapt to a world that no longer functions the way it used to? The volcanic winter did not give them time to reflect deeply. It forced them to act, to improvise, to rely on instinct and ingenuity. Although many would not survive, those who did carried forward not only their genes but the lessons learned from this crucible of hardship. The volcanic winter was more than a climate event, it was a test of resilience, cooperation, innovation, and sheer endurance. Humanity's continued existence depended on these qualities. And even as the planet sank deeper into cold and shadow, somewhere among the scattered bands of survivors, sparks of adaptation began to glow. These sparks would determine whether our species would perish in the darkness or endure long enough to see the world awaken once more. As the volcanic winter deepened and ecosystems unraveled, humanity entered one of the most precarious periods in its entire evolutionary journey. What had begun as a catastrophic eruption evolved into a slow, grinding crisis that reached into every corner of the world where early Homo sapiens lived. Food became scarce, temperatures continued to plummet, and familiar landscapes grew unrecognizable under the weight of cold, ash, and environmental collapse. This was the moment when our species came closest to disappearing, a near-extinction event that scientists now refer to as the genetic bottleneck. But for the people living through it, there was no terminology, no scientific context, only survival. Every day became a negotiation between endurance and despair. Human population numbers, never large to begin with, began to shrink dramatically. Some bands perished entirely, leaving behind only the silent remnants of their camps. Others splintered under stress, losing the cohesion that had been essential for survival. The world felt emptier, quieter, more threatening. To understand the full weight of this moment, one must imagine the population of all humans everywhere reduced to a fraction of what it once was, possibly just a few thousand individuals scattered across continents. That number is smaller than the population of many modern villages. These survivors were isolated, vulnerable, and unaware of one another's existence beyond the reach of their own small territories. Their survival was not guaranteed. Every storm, every failed hunt, every illness had the potential to erase entire lineages. The bottleneck was not a single instant but a long, drawn-out trial imposed by the relentless volcanic winter. Ash in the atmosphere dimmed sunlight to such an extent that plant life collapsed region by region. With vegetation dying, herbivores dwindled. And as herbivores disappeared, predators began to starve. Humans, omnivores who relied on both plants and animals, lost both their primary food sources at once. Even insects, seeds, and small burrowing animals were fewer in number, hidden beneath layers of ash or simply not surviving the cold. Human groups that had once moved confidently across the landscape now found themselves trapped by the scarcity of resources. They stayed close to any place that still offered a hint of life, small pools of water, sheltered valleys, or areas where vegetation retained a fragile hold. Competition for these dwindling niches intensified not only among humans but across entire ecosystems. Groups that might have once avoided conflict now faced desperate choices: compete, flee, or perish. This era likely saw an increase in cooperation among groups that encountered one another peacefully. The sharing of food, fire, and knowledge may have occasionally meant the difference between survival and death. But just as often, these interactions could turn hostile. Human nature was still being shaped, empathy and violence existed side by side, both emerging from the primal instinct to survive. Even within individual bands, social tensions grew. Starvation alters the mind, making patience thin and decision-making erratic. Elders who once guided the group with wisdom now struggled to keep pace. Children, already vulnerable, became even more fragile. Every illness felt heavier, every injury more dangerous. The fragile equilibrium of group life was tested daily. The genetic bottleneck not only reduced population size, it fundamentally shaped the structure of humanity's future genome. With so few survivors, their genetic diversity became the foundation for all humans who would come after them. It is one of the reasons why modern humans are genetically more similar to one another than many other species with larger ancient populations. Every person alive today likely descends from these bottleneck survivors, tiny pockets of resilience scattered across Africa and parts of Asia. But what did these people actually experience in their day-to-day struggle? Each group had its own story, defined by the environment it inhabited. In some regions, humans may have retreated into caves for shelter, seeking warmth and protection from the falling ash. Firelight flickered on cave walls as they huddled together, sharing the warmth of bodies and the last scraps of food. In other places, humans built more robust shelters from wood, bone, and hide, reinforcing them with mud or earth to block the wind. These structures were not permanent homes but desperate refuges against the unrelenting cold. Toolmaking evolved rapidly during this period, driven by necessity. Almost every resource became precious. Stone tools were sharpened and reshaped until they could no longer be salvaged. Spears were reinforced, knives reworked, scraping tools repurposed for different uses. Some groups experimented with new materials or techniques, combining flakes of stone, using bone points more frequently, or developing more effective fire-starting methods. Innovation was no longer a slow evolutionary process, it was a lifeline. Hunting also changed dramatically. With large animals dying off or migrating unpredictably, humans were forced to target smaller game, rabbits, birds, rodents, and fish if they were fortunate enough to have access to water that remained unfrozen or untainted. Tracking became more difficult in the altered landscape, where ash covered footprints and scents dispersed differently in the cold air. Hunters had to adapt quickly, learning to read subtle traces left behind by increasingly elusive animals. The bottleneck era was also a psychological trial. Imagine waking each day to a darkened sky, unsure if the sun would ever fully return. Imagine hearing no birdsong, no insect buzz, no rustle of vegetation. Silence replaced the natural soundtrack of life, a silence so complete that it must have felt oppressive, an ever-present reminder of the fragility of existence. Humans who had once found comfort in predictable patterns of nature now lived with a sense of uncertainty that weighed down every moment. Yet, within this darkness, certain strengths emerged. Groups relied heavily on emotional bonds, finding solace in one another even when hope seemed scarce. The act of sharing, food, fire, shelter, reinforced the sense that survival depended not only on physical strength but on communal resilience. Mothers protected their children with heightened vigilance. Hunters returned not just for themselves but for their entire band. Elder knowledge, though strained by the crisis, became essential, knowing where certain plants might grow despite the cold or recalling distant regions that once held promise became vital pieces of information. Some scientists believe that this near-extinction event may have played a role in accelerating the evolution of social cohesion and empathy. When only a few thousand individuals remain across the entire planet, every life becomes more important. Cooperation could no longer be an option, it had to be a default strategy for survival. Groups that worked together increased their chances of enduring long enough for the climate to stabilize. The bottleneck also encouraged migration into refugia, areas that remained relatively habitable even during the worst climatic conditions. These refuges provided the minimal ecological stability needed for survival. Africa offered a few such regions, particularly in the Rift Valley where geothermal activity, freshwater lakes, and natural shelters created pockets of life. Other potential refuges existed along coastlines where marine life remained somewhat stable, offering a critical food buffer during the collapse of inland ecosystems. Even so, these safe havens were fragile. Competition was fierce, and resources remained thin. The difference between surviving and perishing often came down to chance: a successful hunt, a sheltered valley, a clean water source, or the appearance of an edible plant species that managed to withstand the cold. Over time, the human population reached its lowest point. Although we cannot know the exact number, genetic evidence suggests that all modern humans descend from a shockingly small group of survivors. It is difficult to comprehend how close our species came to extinction. Every modern culture, every language, every idea, every invention, from agriculture to space exploration, descends from those few early humans who endured the worst years of the volcanic winter. In this chapter of our species' story, we see not just loss but endurance. Humanity did not vanish. It persisted, slowly, painfully, but with remarkable resilience. The bottleneck carved vulnerability into our history, but it also carved strength. The survivors emerged not unbroken, but unyielding, shaped by hardship and bonded by the shared struggle to continue the fragile miracle of life. In the depths of the volcanic winter, when the world lay shrouded in cold ash and muted skies, the only warmth early humans could truly rely on came from their small, fragile fires. Across scattered refuges, hidden valleys, sheltered caves, rocky overhangs, tiny camps of flickering light formed like stars fallen to earth. These camps stood as the last beacons of human resilience, shimmering defiantly against the vast darkness that had swallowed the world. Each fire was more than a flame, it was survival itself, a heartbeat of humanity trying desperately not to fade. The members of these small bands lived in close proximity, huddled together beneath animal skins, woven grasses, and shelters reinforced with mud and bone. Ash often coated the roofs, and wind-driven dust seeped through the cracks despite their efforts to seal every opening. Inside, the air was warm but thick with smoke, yet to them, this was comfort. The outside world offered only cold and silence. The firelight painted shadows that danced against stone walls, giving a sense of movement and life in a world where everything else felt still. Food was scarce, and every meal was an event of quiet gratitude. The smell of roasting meat, even when meager in quantity, filled the camp with hope. People ate slowly, savoring the rare moments when hunger eased. Sometimes, the group shared nothing more than a handful of roots or a small bird caught in a hastily crafted trap. But however little they had, they shared it. The instinct for cooperation grew stronger than ever, because starvation was a threat they all understood too well. These camps were shaped not only by survival but by emotion. Fear, grief, and uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone. There were nights when the wind seemed to whisper like lost spirits, and the ash-covered world outside felt like a tomb. Children cried softly, unsettled by a world that had grown colder and darker than anything their brief memories could comprehend. Parents comforted them with soothing touches and murmured sounds, even when they themselves were terrified. Yet amid this struggle, there were also moments of profound intimacy and unity. Humans told simple stories around the fire, stories about animals they once hunted, landscapes that no longer existed, or ancestors whose wisdom they hoped to channel. These tales were less about entertainment and more about preserving identity. When the world seemed intent on erasing them, storytelling became an act of defiance, a reminder that they existed, remembered, and belonged to something greater than the present crisis. The fire itself demanded constant vigilance. Wood was precious, often damp or coated in ash. Keeping it burning required skill and attention. Hunters and gatherers brought back fallen branches, roots, and dried grasses whenever possible, even though the forests had thinned and many trees had died. Sometimes, entire groups had to relocate because a region ran out of fuel. Fire was both their anchor and their burden, losing it meant crisis. Many times, family members took turns guarding the flame through the night, feeding it tiny pieces of wood whenever it threatened to fade. The cold outside was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Temperatures dropped far below anything early humans had experienced before. Without layered hides and carefully maintained fires, frostbite and hypothermia claimed countless lives. People learned to sleep in tight circles, using shared body heat to stay warm. Babies were wrapped in multiple layers of fur, held close to their mothers or elders throughout the night. Every decision, from when to sleep to how to store food, revolved around preserving warmth. The camps grew quieter with time as the harsh conditions took their toll. Illness spread easily among groups weakened by hunger and exposure. Coughs echoed in the darkness, sometimes growing so severe that individuals could no longer eat or drink. Without access to medicines or herbs that were plentiful before the eruption, even minor sickness could become fatal. The grief of losing a group member was immense, not only emotionally but practically. Every life lost meant fewer hands to gather food, fewer voices to warn of danger, fewer hearts to keep hope alive. Despite these hardships, bonds within the group strengthened. Survival demanded unity. When one person grew weak, others supported them. When a child fell ill, the entire camp took turns caring for them. Even in the midst of overwhelming hunger, mothers fed their children first, driven by instinct and love. These small acts of kindness stitched together the fragile fabric of human endurance. There were also rare moments of joy. When hunters returned with more food than expected, laughter bubbled through the camp, quiet at first, then louder, as though they were remembering what it meant to feel alive. When the clouds thinned briefly and a faint ray of sunlight broke through, people stepped outside blinking, raising their hands toward the light as though touching something sacred. On nights when the wind calmed, children played simple games near the fire, their tiny footprints marking the ash-covered ground. The landscape surrounding these camps often appeared alien. Trees stood like ghosts, stripped of leaves and coated in ash. Rivers flowed sluggishly, darkened by sediment. Animal tracks became rare, and when they did appear, they often led to creatures weakened by hunger. The world felt hollow, drained of its former vitality. But these harsh surroundings also shaped the humans who endured them. Their instincts sharpened. Their creativity deepened. Their bonds solidified. Some camps moved periodically, following herds or searching for less damaged areas. These migrations were agonizing, often involving long treks through barren terrain. The ash underfoot shifted like sand, making each step heavy and uncertain. But moving was sometimes necessary to find water, firewood, or simply a place less touched by the bitter winds. Groups that traveled together developed signals, hand gestures, whistles, shared glances, to communicate without drawing attention from predators. Predators themselves behaved differently during this time. Hunger drove them closer to human camps than ever before. The smell of cooking meat, faint but unmistakable, attracted wolves, big cats, and hyenas. Humans constructed crude barriers of branches and stones to deter nighttime visitors, but these defenses were temporary at best. Firelight helped keep predators at bay, though even the bravest animals sometimes tested the edges of the camp, watching with glowing eyes from the darkness. Still, the greatest danger was not predators or hunger, it was despair. The volcanic winter stretched on endlessly, offering no hint that the world would ever return to what it had been. Humans struggled to imagine a future beyond survival. Many nights were spent staring into the fire, silent and contemplative, wondering if their children would live long enough to see the world warm again. And yet, these camps of flickering light endured. In the coldest, darkest chapter of human history, these small groups stood as symbols of stubborn resilience. Each campfire represented life refusing to surrender. Each shared meal, no matter how small, was an affirmation of hope. These early humans did not know that they were carrying the future of an entire species. They knew only that they must keep the fire burning, keep each other warm, and hold on to the fragile thread of existence until the world allowed them to breathe freely again. As the volcanic winter deepened and the world grew colder, the relationships between humans and the animals around them changed in ways both unexpected and terrifying. The great predators of the prehistoric world, creatures that had roamed forests and plains long before humans walked upright, found themselves facing the same challenges as everything else: dwindling prey, collapsing ecosystems, and landscapes transformed by ice, ash, and unrelenting cold. Hunger drove them into territories they had once avoided, and desperation blurred the boundaries between predator and prey in a world reshaped by catastrophe. Humans, weakened by starvation and struggling to stay warm, were suddenly thrust into a harsher competition for survival. Many predators that once thrived in warmer climates now faced environments unfamiliar to them. Their prey, already scarce, became even harder to find. Herbivores moved erratically, chasing patches of vegetation that stubbornly clung to life in sheltered areas. Carnivores followed, but with a fraction of their former success. Leaner, hungrier, and more aggressive than before, these animals posed new dangers to human groups living on the edge of endurance. The instinct to hunt, sharpened by generations of abundance, now collided with the harsh reality of an unstable, dying ecosystem. Humans who ventured out to hunt or gather were no longer competing with predators, they were being hunted by them. Tracks in the snow or ash became warnings, not just clues. The prints of wolves, big cats, hyenas, or even ancient wild dogs were often found alarmingly close to human camps. Sometimes, predators circled these camps at night, their glowing eyes visible just beyond the firelight. The world outside the warmth of a shelter became a place of constant vigilance, where every sound carried the possibility of danger. The cold amplified these threats. Weakened humans could not outrun predators, and the ash-dusted landscape left clear trails that revealed their positions. Even experienced hunters struggled to maintain stealth in powdery ash that shifted with every step. The normal patterns of predator-prey behavior were thrown into chaos. Animals that once avoided direct conflict now took bold risks, driven by an instinct more powerful than fear, starvation. Wolves, in particular, posed a growing challenge. These ancient hunters, known for their endurance and ability to work in organized packs, adapted remarkably to the cold. Their thick fur gave them an advantage in the harsh climate, and their exceptional cooperative strategies allowed them to take down weakened prey that humans desperately needed for themselves. In some regions, wolf packs shadowed human groups for days, waiting for mistakes or signs of vulnerability. A lone human straying too far from camp could easily become prey. Big cats, creatures like leopards and prehistoric lions, also grew bolder. Their stealth and power made them devastating threats. Even weakened by hunger, a single predator could slash through a small human camp if given the opportunity. Some groups learned to listen for subtle shifts in wind, the faint crack of a branch, or the near-silent padding of paws. These were often the only warnings they had. Nights were the most dangerous. In the dim light of fading fires, predators could approach silently, hidden in the darkness beyond the glowing ring of safety. Hyenas, opportunistic and incredibly resilient, scavenged relentlessly. They followed the scent of death, animal or human, with unnerving precision. If a human group lost a member to illness or cold, hyenas might descend on the remains within hours. They tested the bravery of humans repeatedly, drawn by the smell of cooking meat or stored food. Their eerie calls echoed through the winter air, reminding humans that they were never truly alone. But predators were not the only ones adapting. Humans, too, began developing new strategies to survive encounters. They created perimeter defenses around their camps using thorny branches, sharpened stakes, or piles of stones. Hunters learned to work in larger groups, relying on coordinated tactics to scare away or injure predators. Fire became both weapon and shield. Torches were carried during nighttime ventures, their flames swirling in the frozen air like symbols of defiance. There were also times when humans turned the tables. Starvation forced some groups to target predators themselves, an incredibly risky decision, but one that could supply hides for warmth and meat when nothing else was available. Tracking a desperate, hungry animal was terrifying work. Yet for those who succeeded, the rewards often meant extended survival for the entire camp. Still, encounters with predators were often fatal. Weakness from hunger slowed human reflexes. Clumsy movement in ash-covered terrain made escape difficult. Even minor injuries could lead to infection or death. When a predator attacked, survival depended on cooperation, shouts, thrown stones, flaming branches, and a unity of purpose born from necessity. Every victory was temporary, every failure, devastating. The fear of predators seeped into the psychological fabric of human life. Children were taught to stay close to adults at all times. Elders took on watchful roles, listening for suspicious sounds while others slept. The boundary between safety and danger shrank until it rested solely within the dim circle of firelight. In many ways, humans became prey again, just as their earliest ancestors had been millions of years before. Yet this constant tension also strengthened the species. Humans became more attentive to their surroundings, more strategic in their movements, and more innovative in their survival techniques. Predator encounters refined their instincts, sharpening the skills that would one day place them at the top of the food chain. The intelligence, communication, and adaptability that defined humanity were forged in part through these trials against animals that had once been superior hunters. The volcanic winter created an environment where every creature fought for survival, but it was in these brutal interactions that humanity learned to brace itself against the unforgiving world. The predators struggling through the snow were not villains, only fellow survivors caught in the same catastrophic upheaval. They too were fighting a losing battle against hunger and cold, driven not by malice but by instinct. In the end, the camps that survived did so not because they eliminated predators, but because they learned to coexist with them in a state of mutual desperation and wary respect. Humans adapted, endured, and outlasted the worst of the encounters. The predators, once rulers of the wild, gradually succumbed to the changing climate or moved on to search for food elsewhere. These brutal years carved caution into human memory, shaping the way early humans understood the world. Danger was everywhere, within the climate, the landscape, and the creatures that shared the earth with them. But through cooperation, awareness, and resilience, humans held on, surviving encounters that could easily have ended their story forever. Long before written language, long before symbols etched into stone or the first myths told around ancient fires, humanity carried its history in the only place available, the mind. Memories passed through generations not as precise accounts but as emotional echoes, impressions of events so vast and terrifying that they refused to fade completely. The Toba catastrophe, with its darkness, its cold, and its relentless ash, likely carved itself deeply into the psychological landscape of early Homo sapiens. Even though those who survived did not record the eruption in words, the trauma lingered in ways that shaped culture, stories, and human perception for millennia to come. Imagine a child born during the volcanic winter or in the years immediately after. That child would never know a world fully warmed by sunlight. They would grow up under dim skies, hearing elders whisper about a time, before the darkness, when the sun was bright and the world was green. Such a child would form their earliest memories in a world of scarcity, a world where fire replaced daylight, and survival required constant vigilance. Their understanding of nature would be defined by extremes, sudden storms, bitter cold, unpredictability. Even when the climate eventually warmed again, their early impressions would shape their behavior, fears, and beliefs for life. These early impressions, passed through stories and emotional expression, would begin the slow evolution of mythmaking. Humans sitting around a fire, one of their few sources of comfort, would speak softly of the devastating events they experienced or heard about. They might describe the sky turning black, the air burning with ash, or the land dying beneath their feet. Lacking scientific explanation, they would assign meaning to the catastrophe in symbolic or spiritual terms. Perhaps they believed the heavens were angry, or that the earth itself had cried out in pain. Such interpretations, though primitive, were natural attempts to make sense of overwhelming fear. Over generations, these raw memories would transform. Trauma often condenses into simplified stories, stories designed not to convey historical accuracy but to warn, teach, and prepare. Early humans might tell their children of a time when the world nearly ended, when cold and hunger tested every living creature. They might describe a great darkness that swallowed the sky and forced their ancestors to huddle together for warmth and survival. These stories would not have been told for entertainment, they were instructions encoded in narrative form. Lessons on resilience, cooperation, and caution against ignoring nature's power. In many ancient cultures across the world, long after the Toba event, there exist myths about great darknesses, floods, or celestial punishments. While not directly traceable to Toba, it is not impossible that the eruption contributed to a deep-rooted human instinct, the fear that the sky might once again betray them. The idea of a sun that could disappear, of seasons that could fail, of a world suddenly turned hostile, such fears linger in countless myths and folktales. Whether through genetic memory, cultural transmission, or universal human psychology, the shadow of Toba may have stretched far beyond the immediate aftermath. Within small hunter-gatherer groups, memory served as their only archive. Important lessons were woven into the rhythms of storytelling, told at night when the community gathered around the central fire. The flickering flames illuminated faces as elders explained how to find food, predict weather, and recognize danger. And woven subtly into these teachings was the memory of suffering, warnings not to wander too far in search of food, not to ignore the signs of environmental change, and not to take warmth or light for granted. These were echoes of a time when every misstep could mean the end. Such memories, half history, half myth, likely shaped early spiritual beliefs as well. Humans may have worshipped the sun not only for its warmth but because they remembered a time when sunlight nearly vanished. They may have respected fire with a reverence born from trauma, knowing it had saved them when the world grew too cold. Even the concept of protective spirits, ancestral guardians, or cosmic forces may have roots in the desperate need to believe that someone, or something, was watching over them during their darkest era. The Toba event may also have influenced humanity's instinct to imagine cycles of creation and destruction, birth and death, light and darkness. Their world had turned upside down once, almost without warning. It was only logical for them to assume it could happen again. This cyclical worldview became central to many ancient religions, long before agriculture or cities emerged. Psychologically, the bottleneck generations carried a collective scar. Trauma shapes behavior in subtle ways. Groups that survived because of cooperation taught cooperation as a core value. Groups that survived by caution taught fear and vigilance. These emotional imprints did not vanish with the return of sunlight, they became part of the behavioral repertoire of humanity itself. Even after the climate began to improve, the memory of hardship persisted. Children raised during the catastrophic years grew into adults who taught their own children to respect the fragility of life. Their instincts, shaped by real danger, likely contributed to innovations in toolmaking, shelter building, and group cooperation. Trauma, in this sense, became a catalyst for progress. The edge of memory is a fragile place where history blurs into myth. The Toba eruption may not be directly remembered in any single surviving culture, but its emotional legacy may have contributed to the universal human understanding that the world is both beautiful and unpredictable. The instinct to tell stories, to pass down warnings, to imagine worlds destroyed and worlds reborn, all echo this ancient upheaval. Thus, even though the specifics of the eruption faded into prehistory, the deeper emotional truth endured. Humanity survived because it remembered, if not the exact events, then the lessons carved into its collective soul. The edge of memory is where trauma becomes wisdom, and where the first threads of shared human storytelling began to weave the tapestry of all future myth and meaning. As the volcanic winter dragged on and the world remained locked in a state of cold uncertainty, humanity faced a choice that every species encounters when standing on the precipice of extinction: adapt or vanish. For countless months, early Homo sapiens had simply endured, surviving through instinct, cooperation, and sheer willpower. But endurance alone was not enough. The world had changed too violently, too rapidly. To survive the transformed landscape, humans needed more than resilience, they needed ingenuity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, sparks of innovation began to ignite across the scattered pockets of survivors. These innovations did not appear all at once, nor did they arise from a single genius or tribe. They emerged organically, born from desperation and refined through necessity. The harsh environment acted as a relentless teacher, pushing humans to think differently, to solve problems with greater creativity, and to experiment with tools and strategies that had never been tried before. The world that once sustained them had broken, and now they were forced to rebuild their relationship with it from the ground up. One of the first innovations to emerge during this time was the refinement of fire. Fire had always been a defining feature of human life, but the volcanic winter elevated it to an entirely new level of importance. Maintaining a fire through the cold, ash-filled days became both an art and a science. Humans learned to insulate fire pits with stones to retain heat longer. They stored embers inside hollowed bones or wrapped them in layers of bark to carry warmth from one camp to another. Some groups created wind shelters around their fires using stacked stones or hardened mud, reducing smoke loss and increasing efficiency. Toolmaking also underwent significant transformation. With prey growing scarce and hunting becoming increasingly dangerous, humans began crafting more sophisticated weapons and tools to increase their chances of success. Stone blades became sharper and more refined. Spears evolved with improved balance and hardened tips, allowing hunters to strike from safer distances. Some groups began experimenting with composite tools, binding stone fragments to wooden shafts using plant fibers and animal sinew. These compound creations were sturdier and more efficient, representing a leap forward in technological skill. Innovation was not limited to hunting. Gathering food also required new techniques. With many plants dying off, humans learned to identify roots and tubers deep underground, sources of nutrition less affected by the cold. They sharpened digging sticks, crafted new scraping tools, and developed more precise knowledge of which plants remained edible despite the ash-covered environment. Some groups discovered methods of processing otherwise inedible plants, using fire or grinding stones to remove toxins or soften fibrous material. Shelter construction, too, evolved dramatically. Early humans were no strangers to building simple camps, but the volcanic winter demanded more robust protection. Some shelters were reinforced with layers of mud that hardened in the cold, creating natural insulation against the wind. Others were built partially underground, using the earth itself as a shield. Animal hides were stitched together more effectively, using bone needles, another innovation that may have emerged during this trying period, to create warmer clothing and coverings. These hides, once simple garments, now became essential armor against the relentless cold. Perhaps the most transformative innovation, however, came in the form of cooperation. Humans had always worked together in small ways, but the intensity of the crisis pushed them to think more collectively and strategically. Groups began coordinating hunts with levels of precision previously unseen. They developed early forms of signaling, hand gestures, whistles, thrown stones, to communicate silently across distances. Tasks within groups became more specialized. Some individuals focused on crafting tools, others on maintaining fire, others on scouting or gathering. This specialization increased efficiency, allowing groups to operate as cohesive units rather than loose collections of individuals. This cooperation extended beyond immediate survival tasks. During moments of relative safety, people shared knowledge freely. If one group discovered a more effective way to store food or keep a fire burning, neighboring groups might adopt the same technique. These exchanges were not formalized, they happened naturally through observation, imitation, or brief encounters during migrations. But their impact was profound. Knowledge spread more quickly than ever before, and each innovation built upon the last, accelerating human adaptability. Even in the midst of hardship, humans also began expressing themselves in new symbolic ways. Some survivors carved patterns into pieces of bone or stone. These markings may have served practical purposes, such as recording information or identifying tools, but they may also have carried spiritual or emotional significance. In a world where death was a constant presence, symbolic expression offered solace, a way to assert meaning and identity despite overwhelming uncertainty. Innovation reached into the emotional sphere as well. Families and small groups created new ways of maintaining morale. Songs, rhythmic sounds, or simple chants may have been used to unify the group, calm frightened children, or prepare for hunts. Laughter, rare but precious, could still emerge in moments of respite. Humans found comfort in touch, in shared meals, in the warmth of firelight. These emotional innovations, strengthening bonds and preserving hope, were just as vital as tools or shelters. Some groups also adapted by altering their movement patterns. Instead of wandering across vast regions as they once had, many focused on smaller territories where they could predict resources and dangers more accurately. They memorized the locations of microrefuges, areas that retained warmth, water, or plant life despite the volcanic winter. This knowledge became part of an evolving mental map, passed down through generations and expanded slowly as survivors explored cautiously outward. Innovation also emerged in the form of risk management. Humans learned to store food in new ways, burying it in cool soil, placing it in tree hollows, or hanging it above ground to protect it from predators. They developed strategies for guarding water sources, creating systems to rotate watch duties and defend against animal incursions. These practices represented not just survival instincts but the early seeds of planning and long-term thinking. What makes this period remarkable is that these innovations did not arise during a time of abundance or comfort, they were born in a world that was collapsing. Under intense pressure, humanity adapted more rapidly and creatively than ever before. The catastrophe that had nearly destroyed them also catalyzed a burst of transformation that would define the species for millennia to come. These sparks of innovation were not isolated achievements, they were stepping stones. They laid the foundations for more complex behaviors, technologies, and social structures that would emerge long after the volcanic winter ended. In forging new tools, strengthening cooperation, and discovering new ways to survive, early humans planted the seeds of future civilizations. In the darkest chapter of their existence, with extinction looming over every horizon, humanity proved not only its resilience but its remarkable ability to adapt. And in this turning point, as innovations began to accumulate like glowing embers, the path toward the survival and eventual flourishing of our species was set into motion. While much of the world struggled beneath the suffocating grip of volcanic winter, one region stood out as a fragile haven of life, the Great Rift Valley of East Africa. Long before the Toba eruption, this immense geological formation had shaped the evolution of our ancestors by offering diverse landscapes, freshwater lakes, geothermal activity, and fertile soils. Now, in humanity's darkest era, it became a sanctuary, a place where pockets of warmth, water, and vegetation persisted even as the rest of the world froze beneath ash-laden skies. The Rift Valley was not untouched by the catastrophe, but it was wounded rather than destroyed. Its lakes, nourished by underground springs and tectonic activity, provided stable water sources when rivers elsewhere ran dry or froze. Steam vents and geothermal pools generated pockets of warmth that created small, hospitable microclimates. Vegetation around these lakes and thermal zones, though weakened, did not collapse entirely. These fragile oases became lifelines for the scattered bands of Homo sapiens who had survived the initial devastation. It is here, in these narrow ecological refuges, that the ancestors of many modern humans may have found shelter. Groups living near Lake Turkana, Lake Malawi, and Lake Tanganyika were more likely to endure the prolonged cold, not because they were stronger or more advanced, but because nature granted them a narrow margin of survival. The land itself seemed to stand between them and extinction, offering just enough to keep hope alive. Human life in the Rift Valley during this period was still incredibly harsh. Food remained scarce, and the bitter cold reached even into these refuges, especially at night. The sky, dimmed by atmospheric ash, provided little warmth. But unlike other regions, the Rift Valley's ecosystems did not collapse completely. Plants near warm springs continued to grow. Fish remained in the deeper waters of the lakes, offering a reliable food source to those skilled enough to catch them. Animals drawn to these water sources provided opportunities for hunting that no longer existed elsewhere. These environmental advantages shaped the behavior and culture of the survivors. Fishing techniques grew more refined as groups depended increasingly on aquatic life. Nets woven from plant fibers, sharpened bone hooks, and stone weights became common tools among those who lived near the lakes. Some groups fashioned lightweight rafts from reeds or logs to reach deeper waters. Their survival depended on mastering this new domain, and with each generation, the Rift Valley's lakes became central to the identity and livelihood of its people. Hunting, too, took on new patterns. Instead of following migrating herds across vast savannas, humans now stalked animals that remained close to water, gazelles, small antelope, and wary predators that ventured to drink under the cover of darkness. Hunters learned to read the quiet landscape differently: the faintest ripple on the water, the softest crack of twigs at dusk, the shallow prints of animals that trod the muddy shores. Patience and precision became essential skills, taught carefully from elders to youth. Social structures deepened as well. Scarcity forced humans to depend on one another in ways that went beyond basic cooperation. Groups became more cohesive, more emotionally bonded, more protective of their own. Conflict within the group threatened survival, so harmony became a matter of necessity. Elders held an especially important role during this time. Their memory of past seasons, plant cycles, and safe shelters offered crucial guidance. Their wisdom was not an abstract concept but a practical tool for enduring hardship. The Rift Valley also became a center for innovation, but in ways different from the earlier sparks born of desperation. Here, innovation was shaped by opportunity. With water, geothermal warmth, and raw materials available, humans experimented with new tools and strategies. They refined grinding stones to process seeds and roots that still grew near warm zones. They developed more efficient ways to store food, often drying fish or preserving meat using smoke from constantly burning fires. Clothing made from animal hides grew more sophisticated, stitched tightly using bone needles to conserve precious body heat. Symbolic thinking also deepened during this period. The emotional intensity of near extinction brought a need for meaning, belonging, and connection beyond the physical world. Evidence from later archaeological discovery suggests that early humans in East Africa engaged in symbolic activities, painting with ochre, crafting beads from shells, and shaping tools with artistic care. While these behaviors existed before the eruption, the trauma and recovery period may have amplified the human desire to express identity, memory, and hope through art. In these refuges, children grew up surrounded by stories of survival. Elders recounted how the world darkened, how the cold came, how their people endured. These stories carried moral weight: respect nature, stay together, guard the fire, trust the elders, share what little you have. Such lessons became embedded in the cultural fabric of the survivors and likely shaped the development of human cooperation long after the climate recovered. Migration patterns also shifted dramatically. Instead of long-range expansions, humans focused on short, strategic movements between safe zones. Some groups may have traveled from one Rift Valley lake to another, seeking areas less impacted by cold or ash. Others may have remained in a single region for generations, forming deep connections with the land and learning to read its every feature. Over time, knowledge of the valley's resources grew more detailed and more inherited, passed carefully from parent to child. Despite the hardships, life in the Rift Valley offered something rare during the volcanic winter: stability. A fragile, uncertain stability, but stability nonetheless. This allowed human populations in these regions to persist and even slowly begin to recover. As generations passed, the population size remained small but no longer declined. Children survived more frequently. Food sources became more predictable. The cold, while still present, became marginally less lethal. In the greater timeline of human evolution, these small but crucial improvements marked the turning point from collapse to recovery. The Rift Valley survivors became the custodians of genetic diversity that would eventually spread across Africa and, thousands of years later, the rest of the world. Their endurance in these refuges formed the foundation of the human lineage that continues today. The story of the Rift Valley during this era is not one of prosperity but of persistence. It is the tale of a landscape that held firm when much of the world faltered, and of the people who adapted to its offerings with ingenuity, cooperation, and unwavering determination. These survivors, shaped by hardship and strengthened by the land that sheltered them, carried humanity through its most fragile chapter. Their footsteps along the shores of ancient lakes, their fires burning against the cold night air, their whispered stories beneath dim skies, all of these moments became the quiet heartbeat of a species refusing to disappear. As Earth slowly shifted through the long shadow of the volcanic winter, not all humans remained within the refuges of the Rift Valley or other sheltered regions. Some, driven by dwindling resources or the instinctive push for survival, began to move outward once more. These movements were not grand migrations as we might imagine them today, they were quiet, tentative wanderings into landscapes transformed by cold and scarcity. Among the most crucial pathways was the corridor stretching across the Arabian Peninsula, a land that would one day become a crossroads of continents, cultures, and civilizations. But during the aftermath of Toba, it was a landscape both forbidding and strangely full of opportunity. Before the eruption, Arabia had been a mosaic of savannas, wetlands, and grasslands during wetter climatic phases. Early humans had ventured into its open spaces before, following herds or exploring new territories. But the volcanic winter altered its character. Rainfall patterns shifted, and once green regions began to dry and cool. Lakes shrank. Rivers became narrow, meandering threads of water rather than the life-giving arteries they once were. But compared to many other regions devastated by the eruption, parts of Arabia remained habitable, not ideal, but survivable. And in an age where survivability meant life or extinction, that thin margin made all the difference. Groups of humans who left Africa during this period likely followed coastlines first, tracing the edges of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden. Coastal life, though challenging, offered a crucial advantage: access to fish and shellfish. While inland ecosystems struggled, the sea continued to provide relatively stable resources. Shell middens, piles of discarded shells, found in later archaeology hint that these shores may have been lifelines for early migrants, sustaining them through some of the darkest years. But as populations slowly recovered and curiosity returned to human hearts, groups moved deeper inland. The Arabian interior was not the endless desert we envision today. In scattered areas, pockets of vegetation clung to life. Seasonal rains filled depressions with temporary water. The volcanic winter's cool climate may even have made certain routes more passable than they had been during hotter periods, reducing dehydration risks for traveling bands. Still, the journey was perilous. Humans traversing these lands needed every ounce of ingenuity they had cultivated during the crisis. They moved cautiously, always searching for signs of water, animal tracks converging in the distance, patches of green on the horizon, or the moist scent of hidden springs. When they found these precious sources, they settled briefly, gathering strength before continuing onward. These scattered oases became stepping stones, linking Africa to Arabia in a fragile chain of survival. Hunting in Arabia demanded adaptation. The region's wildlife, gazelles, oryx, wild asses, and small mammals, had evolved for speed and endurance across open terrain. Humans developed cooperative hunting methods tailored to these swift creatures, using endurance running, coordinated chases, and ambush strategies perfected in earlier environments. Spears grew lighter, better balanced, more suited for long throws over open ground. Stone tools became sharper, crafted from flint and chert available along ancient riverbeds. For those traveling in family groups, the journey across Arabia was more than a physical challenge, it was an emotional trial. Nights were bitterly cold, with winds sweeping across exposed plains. Fires needed constant tending, often fueled by sparse shrubs or dried grasses. Children were carried or guided carefully over rocky surfaces. Elders leaned on carved walking sticks, their knowledge invaluable but their bodies weary. Each sunrise was both a blessing and a reminder of the distance still ahead. Yet the human spirit persisted, as it always has. Even in this harsh environment, moments of awe and connection emerged. Travelers would sometimes encounter landscapes of breathtaking beauty, towering sandstone cliffs, canyons carved by ancient rivers, and star-filled skies so clear they felt close enough to touch. These sights, though indifferent to their suffering, offered a strange kind of comfort, reminders that the world, despite its dangers, remained a place worth traversing. Intergroup encounters may have occurred along these migration corridors. Some meetings were cautious and tense. Strangers competing for limited resources could not afford to be careless. But others may have led to exchanges of tools, stories, or knowledge. These interactions, however brief, contributed to the spread of innovation and cultural practices refined during the volcanic winter. Such exchanges strengthened humanity's collective resilience. River valleys, such as those connected to ancient Lake El-Waba or the highland areas of Yemen and Oman, provided particularly important refuges along the route. These regions, fed by seasonal monsoons or underground aquifers, supported plant life and attracted animals. Humans who settled temporarily in these areas found reprieve from the harshest conditions and perhaps even moments of abundance. Seeds collected near these valleys might have been stored for later use, dried fish preserved near rocky shorelines, and stone tools replenished from fresh sources of raw material. As the climate very slowly began to recover, parts of Arabia would have grown more hospitable again. Grasses re-emerged in some regions. Animals returned along their migration paths. The winds carried less ash, and days slowly brightened. These gradual improvements encouraged further movement, leading human groups northward toward the Levant or eastward along the southern Arabian coast toward India and beyond. What makes the Arabian Passage so monumental is not merely its geography but its symbolism. It represents humanity's early commitment to exploration, adaptation, and expansion, even in the face of overwhelming environmental change. These migrations were not grand waves but slow pulses, small groups pushing forward, retreating, regrouping, and trying again. Their persistence would eventually shape the genetic and cultural patterns of human populations across Eurasia. Crossing Arabia required courage born from desperation and hope born from memory. Humans remembered the fertile plains of the past, the animals they once hunted, the warm days before the sky dimmed. These memories pushed them forward, whispering that somewhere beyond the horizon, the world might still hold pockets of promise. They walked not because they knew what lay ahead but because standing still meant death. Movement, no matter how uncertain, meant a chance. In time, the footsteps of these early travelers became part of the deep story of humanity's spread across the globe. Their journey across the Arabian sands was not just a migration, it was a testament to the resilience forged in the crucible of catastrophe. And through their survival, they carved a path for future generations, carrying the fragile spark of humanity across continents, ensuring that the story of our species would continue. For years, the Earth had remained draped in a veil of cold and ash, as if the planet itself were mourning the devastation unleashed by Toba. But nothing in nature is truly static. Beneath the gray skies, slow transformations were quietly unfolding. The volcanic aerosols that had once sealed the world in darkness began to thin, swept gradually from the atmosphere by shifting winds and returning rainfall. The sun, though still muted, pressed more insistently through the gloom. And in the faint light that filtered down, seeds buried under ash and ice began to stir once more. It was subtle at first, a delicate green shoot breaking through the hardened soil, a cluster of leaves emerging beside a sheltered rock, the faint buzz of an insect returning to life. But these small signals marked the beginning of the Earth's long healing. The return of warmth was uneven. Some regions thawed quickly, while others remained locked in a stubborn cold. The world was not instantly transformed back into its former state. Instead, it shifted slowly, cautiously, as though testing its own ability to recover. Rainfall patterns changed yet again, this time bringing moisture back to parched regions. Rivers that once trickled now flowed more freely. Lakes filled, their surfaces shimmering with reflections that had been absent during the dim years. Vegetation responded almost instinctively. Grasses spread across open plains. Bushes pushed upward with renewed vigor. Trees unfurled fresh leaves, reclaiming ground they had lost to the volcanic winter. For humans who had survived the long ordeal, these changes felt miraculous. After years of staring into a monochrome world, gray skies, gray ash, gray earth, the sudden appearance of color must have seemed impossibly hopeful. To wake and see the first green sprouts on a hillside or the first wildflower returning to life was not merely a sign of ecological recovery, it was a sign that the world had not abandoned them. The earth was beginning to breathe again. And with its breath came promise. Animal life responded quickly. Herbivores cautiously returned to old grazing grounds, sniffing the fresh growth with both suspicion and hunger. Birds, quiet for years, began to reappear, their wings beating softly across landscapes that had long been silent. Insects, those small, tireless engines of ecosystems, multiplied rapidly. Their quick reproductive cycles allowed them to repopulate regions where their absence had left entire food chains unstable. And as the insects returned, so did the birds and small mammals that fed on them. It was as if nature had been waiting for a single signal, and once given, life surged forward like a river breaking past a dam. Human groups emerging from their refuges witnessed this rebirth with a mix of caution and wonder. They had lived so long in survival mode that the returning abundance seemed dreamlike, almost unreal. Camps that once struggled to find enough food to last a week now found themselves surrounded by slowly recovering landscapes. Plants they remembered from childhood were returning. Water was clearer, no longer thick with ash. Animals appeared more frequently, their bodies sturdier, their movements more confident. This period of gradual restored abundance created opportunities for humans to expand their range once again. They ventured farther from their shelters, exploring old hunting routes and gathering spots. For the first time in years, they found edible berries, nuts, and roots in enough quantity to ease the constant hunger that had become their companion. Fishing grew easier as lakes and rivers stabilized. Firewood became more available, sheds of dried branches left behind after dead trees had finally fallen to the ground. But the world was not the same as before. The ecosystem had been reshaped, pruned by catastrophe, and rebuilt in new patterns. Some species never returned. Others spread into newly opened niches. Humans needed to learn the rhythms of the recovering earth, adjusting their behavior to match the altered landscapes. They became more observant, more attuned to the subtle signs of seasonal changes, and more willing to adapt their strategies. The rebirth of the green world required not only celebration but relearning, an education in how to live in a world reborn from ash. The psychological transformation during this period was profound. Where once fear dominated every decision, now curiosity began to flicker again. Hope, long dormant, returned cautiously, first as relief, then as cautious optimism, and finally as an expanding belief that the worst had passed. Children born after the darkest years grew up with memories of a recovering world rather than one collapsing. Their laughter, their exploration, their youthful boldness breathed new life into human groups that had grown weary from constant struggle. Humans also began to re-establish more stable patterns of movement. Groups that had remained near lakes or geothermal refuges now explored surrounding regions, seeking new habitats and reconnecting with lands their ancestors once knew. These small expansions became the first steps of population recovery. Though still small in number, humans were no longer diminishing, they were slowly, steadily, growing. The return of vegetation encouraged the development of new tools and techniques. Basket weaving for collecting plants became more refined. Digging sticks and grinding stones were crafted with greater purpose. Clothing improved as skins from healthier animals became more available. Fire-making materials became easier to find, allowing humans to preserve and transport embers less desperately. Every innovation that had emerged during the worst years became even more valuable now that conditions allowed for experimentation and refinement. Symbolic expression also flourished during this renewal. Humans painted with ochre again, using the returning colors of the world as inspiration. They carved small objects, figurines, beads, patterns etched into bone or wood, not only as functional tools but as expressions of identity and gratitude. Rituals may have emerged to honor the return of life, dances near the lakeshore at sunrise, offerings of food to unseen forces, or simple communal gatherings where firelight reflected in the eyes of people who finally believed they had a future. The green world's rebirth also meant the rebirth of exploration. As vegetation spread, humans followed it, curious about what lay beyond the next hill, the next valley, the next stream. Their survival instincts remained sharp, but their imagination, long suppressed by necessity, began to reawaken. This renewed curiosity would eventually propel them beyond Africa and Arabia into new continents. But the seeds of that future expansion were planted here, in this fragile era of recovery. What makes this rebirth extraordinary is not only the Earth's resilience but humanity's ability to respond to it. The world had tried to erase them, yet they persisted. And when the land began to heal, humans were ready to grow alongside it. The green shoots pushing through the ash symbolized more than ecological recovery, they symbolized the reawakening of hope within the human heart. The volcanic winter had nearly extinguished the species, but the rebirth of the green world marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was a world reshaped by fire and frost, but also a world ripe with possibility. And in this renewed landscape, humanity found not just survival, but the first stirring of a destiny still unfolding tens of thousands of years later. As Earth continued its slow return to warmth and color, the scattered survivors of the Toba catastrophe began to experience something they had not felt in generations: growth. It was not sudden or dramatic, there was no single moment when humans collectively realized their population was recovering. Instead, it happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, as each small group found itself welcoming more children who survived their early years, more adults who lived longer, and more elders who passed on their wisdom before death. Life, after being pushed to the brink, was beginning to expand again. For decades, perhaps even centuries, human population numbers had dwindled dangerously. Many families had no more than a handful of surviving members. Entire lineages disappeared without a trace. But as food sources returned and climate stabilized, birth began to once again outpace death. Infants, once so vulnerable to cold, malnutrition, and disease, now had a higher chance of living past their first winters. Mothers found more nourishment, allowing them to breastfeed longer and remain healthier during pregnancy. The emotional weight that had hung over every birth, an unspoken fear that the child might not see adulthood, slowly began to lift. Children became the symbol of a new era. Their presence brought laughter back into camps where silence had become the norm. As they grew, they explored the recovering landscapes with curiosity untouched by the trauma their elders carried. To them, the world was not a place of endless ash and cold, it was a place of green grass, warm sun, and returning animals. Their innocence, their resilience, and their boundless curiosity were the first signs that humanity was stepping out of its long shadow. As human numbers increased, social structures began to evolve. Groups no longer had to cling desperately to a handful of individuals for survival. Families grew larger, communities more complex. Tasks could be divided more effectively. Some individuals specialized in toolmaking, others in gathering plants, others in tracking animals. This specialization made life more efficient and laid the foundation for more stable societies. Communication also deepened. Language, still in its early stages, became more nuanced as larger groups required clearer ways to share information, coordinate activities, and pass down knowledge. Words for new plants, new tools, new landscapes began to emerge. Stories became richer, describing not just survival but the world's transformation and humanity's place within it. The experience of near extinction may have intensified the emotional depth of communication, strengthening bonds and shaping the development of early culture. As populations grew, humans began to reconnect with distant groups. During the volcanic winter, many bands became geographically isolated, separated by inhospitable terrain or lack of resources. But with the world healing, migration paths reopened. Trails once blocked by ash or storms became passable again. Humans who had long thought themselves alone encountered others who looked like them, spoke similar sounds, and shared familiar tools. These reunions were profound moments where humanity realized it was not a single thread but a tapestry slowly weaving itself back together. Such interactions had lasting consequences. They promoted the exchange of ideas, tools, survival strategies, and even genetic diversity. When small groups intermingled, they strengthened their resilience against disease and environmental stress. Genetic mixing reduced the risks associated with the population bottleneck, preventing harmful mutations from becoming widespread. These encounters also created alliances, loose networks of groups that shared hunting grounds, exchanged resources, or joined forces during migrations. With expanding populations came expanding memory. Elders who had experienced the volcanic winter firsthand began to teach not just how to survive, but why survival mattered. They told stories of the time when the sky went dark, when hunger clung to every breath, when fire was the only warmth against the cold. But they also shared stories of renewal, of the first green shoots after years of gray, of animals returning to the plains, of children being born into a world with hope. These stories became the cultural backbone of early humans, shaping values like gratitude, cooperation, and respect for nature. Hunting improved dramatically as prey animals multiplied. Herds of antelope, gazelles, and wild cattle grew larger, their populations rebounding alongside the recovering vegetation. Hunters sharpened their skills, using techniques refined during the years of scarcity. Spears became more aerodynamic, stone points more precise. Some groups began experimenting with new weapon types, like the spear thrower, which increased range and accuracy. As hunts became more successful, humans had more time to devote to toolmaking, crafting, exploring, and social bonding. Gathering also became more productive. Women and men alike learned to identify which plants thrived after the volcanic winter and at what times they were most nutritious. New plant species, those that had taken advantage of the altered soil composition, entered the human diet. Cooking techniques expanded as humans experimented with roasting, boiling, and grinding different foods. Fire, once a desperate necessity, became an instrument of creativity. As life improved, humans began to settle for longer periods in certain areas. These were not permanent settlements as we know today, but seasons-long camps near dependable water sources, grazing animals, or abundant plant life. Such semi-sedentary behavior strengthened community ties and allowed for deeper cultural development. Families expanded, and the roles of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and older siblings became more clearly defined. The population reawakening also brought new challenges. More people meant more competition for resources, even in recovering landscapes. Conflicts between groups, once rare during the worst years of survival, began to occur again. But these conflicts also drove innovation. Humans learned negotiation, alliance building, and territorial awareness. Some disputes ended peacefully, others did not, but in all cases, humans were learning the social complexities required for managing larger populations. Despite these emerging tensions, the overarching trend was clear: humanity was growing stronger. Physically, socially, and culturally, they were rising from the brink. The lessons learned during the bottleneck, cooperation, innovation, adaptation, became embedded in their way of life. Those who had survived hardship now instilled resilience into their children. Those children passed it on to the next generation. The population reawakening marked not just a numerical recovery but an evolutionary milestone. It signaled that humanity had not only endured catastrophe but had emerged from it more capable, more connected, and more inventive than before. The near-extinction event forged traits that would serve humans well in the millennia to come: curiosity, problem-solving, empathy, and a powerful instinct for community. From these humble beginnings, small camps of survivors scattered across a healing world, humanity began its long ascent toward becoming the dominant force on the planet. And though they could not have known it then, the children playing in the reborn grasslands were the seeds of future civilizations, carrying forward the indomitable spirit that had pulled their ancestors back from the edge of oblivion. Tens of thousands of years after the Toba catastrophe, when the world had long since healed and humanity had spread far across continents, the memory of the eruption seemed to have vanished. No one alive could recall the cold years, the dim skies, or the days when fire kept human life from slipping into extinction. Yet the past is never truly lost. It leaves traces, silent, enduring, woven into the very fabric of the earth and the bodies of those who walk upon it. For the Toba eruption, those traces lie in two places: the stones beneath our feet and the DNA within our cells. Together, they tell a story barely understood by the people who lived through it, yet unmistakably written into the deep record of human history. The first echoes were found in stone, layers of volcanic ash spread across continents, preserved like pages in a geological book. Thousands of kilometers from the eruption site, archaeologists uncovered thick deposits of fine gray ash embedded within ancient soil. These ash layers appeared in India, Malaysia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even parts of Africa. Their chemical signatures matched perfectly with the volcanic material from the Toba caldera, confirming that the eruption had been a global event, its reach spanning continents. Each ash layer marked the exact moment the world changed, a thin, silent line recording the instant the sky darkened. Archaeologists studying human tools and settlements above and below these ash layers noticed something remarkable. Below the ash, stone tools were widespread, varied, and abundant, evidence of thriving populations. Above the ash, tools often became scarce, more uniform, or abruptly absent, hinting at periods of cultural disruption. In some places, however, tools continued with surprising continuity, suggesting that certain groups endured the catastrophe without total collapse. These findings painted a complex picture: humanity had suffered deeply, yet pockets of resilience existed. This discovery challenged earlier assumptions of uniform devastation and hinted at the adaptability that had carried our ancestors through. But the most profound echoes of the Toba event were not found in rocks at all, they were found in the DNA of every human alive today. Geneticists studying patterns of human diversity made a startling observation: modern humans are far more genetically similar to one another than most species with comparable global ranges. This unusual uniformity suggested something dramatic in our past, a reduction so severe that our population may have dropped to a mere few thousand individuals. The genetic bottleneck theory emerged, proposing that humanity's ancestors had passed through a narrow window of survival, just as the archaeological record suggested. While scientific debate continues about the exact size of our ancestral population during the bottleneck, the genetic evidence undeniably points to a dramatic constriction. Certain gene lineages vanished entirely, leaving no trace in modern populations. Others became disproportionately common, preserved simply because their carriers survived the crisis. Our mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, reveals that all humans today share strikingly recent common ancestors. These ancestral patterns reflect not only survival but the fragility of a species when forces beyond its control reshape the world. DNA also carries evidence of human movements during this era. By comparing genetic markers across populations, researchers have traced migration pathways from Africa into Arabia, then into Eurasia and beyond. These pathways align with the archaeological findings of refugia, regions where humans survived despite the catastrophic climate shifts. The Rift Valley, coastal corridors, and sheltered oases appear again and again in both genetic signatures and material remains. Humanity's journey through the bottleneck was not uniform but scattered across landscapes that offered the smallest margins of safety. One of the most fascinating revelations comes from studying genes associated with environmental resilience. Certain genetic traits, related to metabolism, temperature tolerance, or immune function, appear to have been strongly favored during the bottleneck period. These traits may have helped our ancestors endure cold, famine, or disease in ways that allowed their descendants to flourish. In essence, the volcanic winter acted as a powerful selective filter, shaping the human genome in ways that still influence our biology today. But the echoes of Toba are not purely biological, they are cultural too, faintly detectable in the earliest symbols of human creativity. Some researchers propose that the cognitive leap associated with the emergence of symbolic behavior may have been intensified by the crisis. When humanity nearly vanished, cooperation and communication became more vital than ever. Groups who shared knowledge, comfort, stories, and strategies had better chances of survival. Over time, these practices may have evolved into complex language, rituals, and art. Cave paintings, beads, carved tools, and ochre markings appear in the archaeological record not long after the bottleneck period. While not direct evidence of Toba's influence, they may represent the flowering of cultural identity that emerged when humans began rebuilding their world. The trauma of near extinction may have strengthened the instinct to mark existence, to create memory, and to connect with one another through shared meaning. These early cultural expressions were humanity's way of saying, "We are still here." The stones and DNA also reveal something more subtle, a story of migration shaped by necessity. As climates warmed, humans expanded outward, retracing old paths and forging new ones. They moved into the Levant, across the Arabian Peninsula, along the coasts of South Asia, and eventually out toward Southeast Asia and Oceania. Later waves moved north into Europe and west into the far reaches of Africa. Each migration left genetic footprints that scientists can follow today. These patterns show how small, isolated groups grew, merged, separated, and reunited over thousands of years, forming the rich tapestry of human diversity. Perhaps the most humbling echo is the realization that every person alive today is connected through the survival of a few thousand ancestors who endured conditions that could easily have erased our species. Their genetic legacy threads through every human lineage, binding global populations with a shared origin in hardship and resilience. When we examine our DNA, we uncover a story of vulnerability intertwined with strength, a reminder that we are all descendants of survivors who faced unimaginable challenges and emerged transformed. The stones remind us what happened. The DNA reminds us who survived. Together, they tell a story that no oral tradition preserved, no myth remembered, and no ancient carving described. Yet the truth endured, waiting patiently for science to uncover it. Humanity's path almost ended before it truly began. And it was through adaptability, cooperation, and a relentless will to continue that our ancestors carried us through one of the greatest trials life has ever imposed on our species. In these echoes, etched in stone layers beneath our feet and written in the genetic code within every cell, we find not just evidence of a catastrophe, but a testament to human endurance. The Toba eruption shaped us in ways our ancestors could never have understood, forging traits that still guide us today. And in listening to these ancient echoes, we learned something deeply important: survival is not merely about strength, but about memory, adaptation, and the fragile threads of connection that hold humanity together across time. In the long arc of human history, the Toba catastrophe stands as a silent turning point, an event that reshaped not only the planet but the psychology, culture, and destiny of our species. Long after the ash settled and the climate warmed, the descendants of those first survivors walked into a world profoundly altered by the pressures their ancestors had endured. The challenges of the volcanic winter etched new behaviors, instincts, and patterns of thought into humanity, shaping the world we inherited in ways both subtle and immense. To understand this world, one must first imagine what it meant to grow, generation after generation, in the aftermath of a near extinction. The survivors who emerged from refuges across Africa and beyond carried with them memories, some conscious, others embedded deep within their instincts, of the fragility of life. Their minds had been forged in scarcity, sharpened by danger, and softened only by the necessity of cooperation. These early humans were not merely biological survivors, they were psychological inheritors of trauma, resilience, and profound adaptability. One of the most significant legacies was the strengthening of social bonds. During the harshest years, cooperation became the only path to survival. Food was shared, fires were tended collectively, and even strangers encountered along migration routes might be treated with caution but also with recognition of shared struggle. This cooperative spirit did not vanish when the world healed. Instead, it blossomed. Humans became more community-oriented, more capable of empathy, more inclined to form alliances that extended beyond their immediate family. These social networks laid the foundation for complex societies that would eventually arise thousands of years later. The experience of prolonged danger also reinforced the importance of communication. Early language, once simple and practical, grew richer as humans needed to convey more detailed information, where food could be found, how to avoid predators, how to craft better tools, how to navigate changing landscapes. The vocabulary of survival expanded into the vocabulary of culture. Over time, this linguistic growth allowed humans to express abstract thought, emotional experience, and shared memory. The seeds of storytelling, ritual, and philosophy were planted in the soil of catastrophe. Humans also inherited a deep respect for fire. During the volcanic winter, fire was more than warmth, it was life itself. It protected camps from predators, allowed for cooking in an age of scarce food, and provided a sense of security in an otherwise unpredictable world. This reverence for fire persisted, shaping everything from mythology to technological innovation. Fire became a symbol of knowledge, creativity, and transformation, an image that would appear in spiritual traditions across countless cultures. Nature, too, was viewed differently after Toba. The eruption demonstrated the Earth's immense power, its ability to nurture life and to extinguish it without warning. This duality influenced early spiritual beliefs, inspiring reverence, caution, and an understanding that the natural world was not merely scenery but a force to be respected. Many ancient cultures later developed concepts of balance, cycles, and natural laws, ideas that may have quietly originated from ancestral memories of environmental upheaval. The scarcity experienced during the bottleneck years also shaped human resourcefulness. Innovation was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Every tool had to be made more efficient, every strategy refined, every bit of knowledge passed down carefully. This culture of innovation persisted long after the crisis. The descendants of the survivors inherited an instinct to improve, adapt, and solve problems creatively, a trait that would eventually propel humans to build civilizations, explore oceans, cultivate crops, and develop technologies unimaginable to their ancestors. Another inheritance was mobility. Humans who survived the volcanic winter were those willing to move, to leave familiar lands, search for new resources, and risk the unknown. This migratory spirit became deeply embedded in human nature. Even after the world stabilized, humans continued to explore, expand, and settle new regions. Over thousands of years, this instinct for movement carried them across deserts, mountains, forests, and eventually oceans. The entire map of human dispersal is a testament to a species shaped by the need to seek safer, better lands when survival depended on it. Perhaps the most profound inheritance, however, was the human relationship with uncertainty. The Toba catastrophe shattered any illusion of a predictable world. It taught our ancestors that change could be sudden, severe, and indifferent to human needs. This understanding bred both caution and curiosity. Humans learned to read subtle shifts in the environment, to anticipate changes, and to prepare for the unexpected. But they also learned to question, investigate, and wonder about the forces shaping their world. The desire to understand nature, the foundation of science itself, may have been sparked by this ancient brush with extinction. Emotionally, the descendants of Toba carried a dual legacy. On one hand, they inherited resilience, the ability to withstand hardship, endure loss, and rebuild. On the other, they inherited fear, a lingering awareness of vulnerability. This combination created a powerful psychological engine. Fear kept them cautious and observant. Resilience propelled them forward, ensuring that fear did not become paralysis. Together, they shaped a species capable of navigating both the beauty and the brutality of the world. These traits influenced not just survival but culture. Rituals surrounding life and death may have grown from the collective trauma of losing so many. Ceremonies honoring ancestors, celebrating births, and marking transitions likely emerged as ways to create stability in a world that felt unstable. Art, music, and symbolic expression may have served as emotional outlets, tools to process grief, preserve memory, and bind communities together. The earliest cave paintings, beads, and carvings were not mere decorations, they were echoes of a world that had been lost and a hope for the world being rebuilt. As humans settled new lands and populations grew, the lessons of the bottleneck years remained embedded in their behavior. They formed tight-knit communities, developed cooperative strategies, and adapted to diverse environments with remarkable speed. Everywhere they went, they carried the invisible imprint of their ancestors' struggle. This imprint shaped the cultures of hunter-gatherers, the rise of agriculture, the development of trade networks, and eventually the birth of cities and civilizations. The world we inherited from the survivors of Toba is a world built on resilience. It is a world where cooperation triumphs over isolation, where innovation emerges from necessity, and where the memory of vulnerability encourages the pursuit of knowledge and safety. Every technological advancement, every cultural milestone, every social institution carries within it a faint echo of that ancient crisis. And perhaps the greatest inheritance of all is the understanding, lurking deep within the human mind, that survival is not guaranteed. It must be earned, protected, and continually reimagined. This awareness has driven humanity to push boundaries, solve complex problems, and look beyond the horizon for answers. It is the silent gift left by those who endured the darkest winters and still believed in the return of warmth. The Toba catastrophe was not merely an event confined to the deep past, it became a silent teacher, leaving behind lessons etched into the very nature of humanity. Though the survivors could not articulate these lessons in grand philosophical terms, their actions, instincts, and adaptations shaped a blueprint for how future generations would respond to danger, uncertainty, and change. Long after the volcanic ash faded and the world returned to warmth, these inherited lessons continued to influence how humans understood themselves and their place within the fragile balance of nature. One of the most enduring lessons was the importance of cooperation. At the brink of extinction, humans discovered that isolation was fatal but unity could save lives. The harsh years following the eruption demanded teamwork in every aspect of survival, finding food, maintaining fire, protecting children, defending against predators, and navigating dangerous landscapes. Cooperation was not just beneficial, it became essential. This understanding carried forward into humanity's cultural evolution. The drive to form communities, build alliances, share knowledge, and act collectively during crises is deeply rooted in the experiences of those ancient survivors. Even today, moments of global crisis, from natural disasters to pandemics, activate this instinct for collective action. It is a legacy of the bottleneck years, reminding us that we endure best when we endure together. Another profound lesson was adaptability. The survivors of Toba lived through one of the most extreme environmental disruptions in human history. Temperatures dropped drastically, food scarcity became widespread, and ecosystems collapsed. In that world, rigid behavior meant death. Those who adapted, who experimented with new tools, sought new food sources, altered their migration patterns, or innovated in shelter construction, were the ones who survived. This adaptability became one of the defining features of Homo sapiens. It allowed our species to thrive in deserts, tundras, mountains, rainforests, and countless other environments. The ability to modify behavior, innovate under pressure, and remain flexible is one of the gifts passed down from those who survived Toba's wrath. The catastrophe also taught humanity humility. Before the eruption, early humans moved through their world with a sense of stability, even if they did not consciously understand it. The seasons changed predictably. Hunting grounds remained familiar. Water sources persisted. But Toba shattered that illusion. Humans witnessed the sky grow dark, temperatures fall, animals vanish, and landscapes die. They saw firsthand that the Earth was not a passive backdrop but a vast, powerful force capable of reshaping life in an instant. This recognition likely laid the groundwork for early spiritual beliefs, reverence for nature, fear of cosmic events, respect for the sun and elements. Even in modern times, this humility lingers. We build technologies and civilizations, yet we remain aware, sometimes painfully, that natural forces still hold immense power. A subtler but equally important lesson was the value of knowledge. In the darkest years of the volcanic winter, the wisdom of elders became invaluable. Those who remembered how to find food in lean seasons, how to track animals, how to build shelters or preserve fire were crucial to their group's survival. This elevated knowledge from a practical skill to a cultural treasure. Generation after generation began placing greater emphasis on learning, teaching, storytelling, and preserving information. This mindset eventually blossomed into everything from oral traditions to scientific inquiry. The basic idea that knowledge can save lives may well have its roots in the lived experience of those ancient survivors. The Toba event also instilled an early appreciation for foresight. Humans who stored food, protected tools, or prepared for seasonal changes had better chances of survival. This encouraged an awareness of the future, an ability to think beyond the present moment. Over time, this foresight evolved into long-term planning, agriculture, architecture, and eventually entire civilizations built on the ability to anticipate and prepare. The seeds of strategic thinking, the understanding that tomorrow matters as much as today, may have sprouted in the ashes of Toba. One of the deepest lessons humanity inherited was the recognition of vulnerability. The survivors knew intimately how close they had come to extinction. Their world had shifted abruptly, without warning, reminding them that life was fragile and unpredictable. This awareness likely shaped early rituals surrounding life and death, the development of protective deities or spirits, and the cultural importance of community care. Vulnerability, paradoxically, made humans stronger, more cautious, more observant, and more empathetic. The catastrophe also demonstrated the interconnectedness of ecosystems. When plants died, herbivores disappeared. When herbivores vanished, predators starved. When animals disappeared, humans suffered. This chain reaction highlighted a powerful truth: life is woven into intricate webs, and a disturbance in one part of the web ripples through the whole system. Although early humans did not articulate ecological theory, they learned it through lived experience. They saw the world not as isolated fragments but as a network of relationships: plants, animals, climate, and humans tied together in a delicate balance. In the modern era, this lesson resonates strongly. Humanity now faces global challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, that echo the ancient vulnerabilities experienced after Toba. The knowledge that environmental change can threaten human survival reminds us of the importance of stewardship and awareness. The past becomes a guide for the future, urging us to respect the forces that shape our planet. Perhaps one of the most important legacies of the Toba survivors is hope. Despite living through years of darkness, hunger, and uncertainty, they never stopped trying. They sought food even when it seemed impossible. They protected their children even when danger surrounded them. They adapted, innovated, and held on with a determination that defies imagination. Their hope was not naive, it was a survival strategy. Hope kept them moving forward, kept them building fires, kept them believing that the world would one day warm again. And they were right. In this sense, the Toba catastrophe gifted humanity a deeper understanding of resilience. It showed that survival is not the absence of struggle but the persistence through it. It revealed that even when the world seems to end, life can find a way to rebuild. And it instilled in our species a quiet but powerful truth: adversity can shape us, strengthen us, and prepare us for challenges yet unseen. The lessons from the brink are not confined to the past, they are carried within each of us. They remind us that humanity's journey has always been precarious, always defined by resilience, cooperation, knowledge, adaptability, and hope. And as we face the uncertainties of our own time, these ancient lessons remain as vital as ever, urging us to remember where we came from and what it took for our species to endure. Long before cities rose, long before the first seeds of agriculture were planted, long before any written word existed, humanity stood on a knife's edge. The Toba eruption had pushed our ancestors to the brink of oblivion, reducing their numbers to a fraction so small that, by all logic, our species should not have survived. And yet, against every odd, they endured. This survival was not just a biological event but an emotional and spiritual triumph, a fragile miracle that would echo through every generation that followed. In understanding this moment, we come closer to understanding ourselves, who we are, where we come from, and why our existence feels at times both improbable and precious. It is easy in the modern world, surrounded by technology and abundance, to forget how thin the thread of our history truly is. But for our ancestors living through the volcanic winter, nothing was guaranteed. Each sunrise was a quiet victory. Each breath taken in the cold air was a reminder that life persisted despite nature's violent attempts to silence it. The fragile miracle of humanity was forged not in comfort, but in suffering. And suffering gave birth to resilience. Imagine a small human camp, no more than 20 or 30 individuals, huddled together in the dim light of a fire. Their clothes are patched furs, their shelters are built from branches and skins, their food supply uncertain from one day to the next. Children sleep close to their mothers, and elders whisper stories into the night, passing down the memory of how the world once was. Everyone listens because memory has become their greatest compass. They do not know that the world will eventually recover, that green will return, that warmth will rise again. They only know that to survive, they must stay together. And they do. In this fragile unity lay the foundations of what makes us human. Compassion was no longer optional, it was a survival mechanism. The weak were not abandoned, because every life had value in such small groups. Food was shared even when there was barely enough for one person. Knowledge was passed from elder to child because forgetting meant death. These emotional instincts, empathy, cooperation, loyalty, became embedded in our species, shaping the societies we would eventually build. The miracle of us is rooted in these moments of quiet sacrifice. Even more astonishing is the individuality of every person who survived. Each ancestor was a complete human being, thinking, feeling, fearing, loving, just like us. They held dreams and insecurities. They worried for their families. They found beauty even in bleak landscapes. Their hearts beat with the same rhythm of hope and despair that beats in ours. And though they lived in a world vastly different from today, the core of their humanity was already present. Their survival did not just preserve bodies, it preserved consciousness, emotion, imagination. Without them, every poem, every painting, every scientific breakthrough, every moment of joy we now experience would have been impossible. The fragility of this survival is mirrored in our genetics. Modern humans are remarkably similar compared to other species because our ancestors nearly vanished. A single environmental catastrophe compressed our genetic diversity into a narrow funnel. And yet, this genetic narrowing did not weaken us, it strengthened our interconnectedness. Every person alive today shares a lineage that traces back to those few survivors. The miracle is not just that they lived, but that through them, we are all connected, woven into a single tapestry pulled from the edge of extinction. As the world slowly healed and the green returned, humanity began its long climb back from the brink. New generations grew up in landscapes no longer dominated by ash but by rebirth. They were stronger, better adapted, and shaped by the lessons their parents had learned through suffering. These children played in the fields, learned to hunt in the returning forests, and explored the rivers that flowed again with clarity. They grew up knowing only that their parents had endured something terrible, but without direct memory of the crisis themselves. They carried the future with a lightness their elders had lost. This generational transition was vital. Trauma does not just destroy, it transforms. The survivors of the bottleneck carried within them a mix of caution and strength, while the next generation carried hope and curiosity. Together, these traits formed the psychological blueprint of modern humans, wary of danger yet drawn toward the unknown, shaped by fear yet motivated by imagination. The volcano had reshaped the earth, but it had also reshaped us. And as populations grew again, the fragile miracle of survival matured into something more profound. Humanity began to flourish. Our ancestors learned to track the stars, carve symbols into stone, adorn their bodies with jewelry, and paint stories onto cave walls. These acts were not mere decorations, they were declarations: we survived. We are here. Our lives matter. Art, ritual, and storytelling were ways of asserting meaning in a world that had nearly erased them. In every brushstroke, every rhythm of a drum, every handprint on the wall of a cave, there was gratitude, an unconscious celebration of existence. Even today, the miracle echoes in our behavior. Our ability to empathize, to cooperate in large groups, to imagine futures beyond our present circumstances, all of these capacities were shaped by the crucible of ancient catastrophe. When modern humans gather around a campfire, tell stories, or face hardship together, we unconsciously reenact the patterns that kept our ancestors alive. The world they inherited became the foundation of the world we now inhabit. But the true lesson hidden within the fragile miracle of our survival is this: existence is never guaranteed. The same earth that nurtures us can threaten us. The same world that sustains life can transform abruptly. The Toba eruption is a reminder that our species is not invincible, not then, not now. Yet it also proves that we possess something extraordinary, the capacity to endure even when the odds seem impossible. We live in a time where global risks, climate change, natural disasters, emerging diseases, once again test the limits of human resilience. But unlike our ancestors, we possess knowledge, technology, and the ability to communicate across the entire planet. The miracle is no longer just survival, it is awareness. Understanding our past gives us the tools to shape our future. The fragile miracle of us is not just a chapter in our history, it is the foundation of our identity. We are the descendants of survivors, inheritors of their courage, carriers of their hope. When the world tried to erase us, we held on. And in doing so, we became something extraordinary, a species defined not by strength alone, but by compassion, ingenuity, memory, and the unyielding will to continue. Every human life today, every thought, every breath, every dream, is part of the fragile miracle forged in fire and darkness tens of thousands of years ago. And as long as we remember this, we remember what it truly means to be human. Though the Toba eruption occurred nearly 74,000 years ago, its shadow stretches quietly into the modern era, influencing the way we understand volcanic hazards, climate risk, and the fragility of global systems. Today, scientists study Toba not only as an ancient catastrophe but as a blueprint for what a future supereruption might mean for humanity. Its scale, thousands of times larger than typical volcanic events, remains a stark reminder that Earth's geological forces still hold the power to disrupt civilization on a planetary level. Modern monitoring systems track supervolcanoes across the world, including Yellowstone in the United States, Taupo in New Zealand, and Era in Japan. These sites show signs of deep magma chambers and past mega-eruptions, though none appear close to erupting today. Still, Toba teaches us that such eruptions rarely give clear warnings. Geological pressure builds slowly, invisibly, over millennia. And when the breaking point arrives, the consequences can ripple across the globe within days. In the age of global dependency, international trade, interconnected economies, and shared technologies, a volcanic winter like the one after Toba would pose risks unlike anything early humans faced. Crop failures could sweep across continents. Sunlight reduction could disrupt agriculture, energy grids, and ecosystems. Air travel would halt. Supply chains would crumble. Yet the lesson from our ancestors remains relevant: survival depends on adaptability, cooperation, and the ability to prepare for the unexpected. Toba's scientific legacy also shapes our understanding of climate change. The eruption showed how sensitive Earth's systems are to sudden atmospheric disturbances. Just as volcanic ash can cool the planet, human emissions can warm it. Both extremes reveal how precarious the balance truly is. By studying Toba, scientists gain insight into how rapid shifts in climate affect ecosystems, food sources, and human resilience, a lesson increasingly important in a warming world. But perhaps the most profound influence of Toba's shadow lies not in science, but in perspective. Knowing that our species once stood inches from extinction reshapes how we see ourselves. It humbles us. It reminds us that humanity is not separate from nature's forces but bound to them. And it reveals that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, we have endured before, and can endure again. Toba's shadow is not only a warning. It is also a testament to the extraordinary resilience at the core of what it means to be human.